Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. It was early spring when I got the call. The kind of spring where winter still clings to the air, refusing to let go completely. I remember because I was standing on my back porch in Portland, watching my breath form little clouds in the crisp morning air. My name's Dalton and I'm a contractor by trade, but that doesn't quite cover it. See, I specialize in the kind of jobs most folks would turn down, the ones way out in the middle of nowhere, where civilization feels like a distant memory. The caller introduced himself as Richard Hawthorne, speaking on behalf of the Oregon Department of Forestry. His voice was gruff, businesslike, but there was an undercurrent of urgency that piqued my interest. "Mr. Walker," he said, "we've got a situation out in the Siskiyou National Forest. There's an old fire lookout tower that needs some serious restoration work. It's been abandoned for years, but with the fire seasons getting worse, we need to get it back online. You come highly recommended for this kind of job." I leaned against the railing, considering the offer. The Siskiyou wasn't exactly a stone's throw away. We were talking deep wilderness, right up against the California border. But hell, that's exactly the kind of challenge I lived for. "Sounds interesting," I replied, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. "What's the catch?" Hawthorne chuckled, but it was a dry sound, devoid of humor. "The catch, Mr. Walker, is that it's about as remote as you can get without leaving the state. No cell service, no nearby towns. You'd be completely on your own out there for at least a month, maybe two. Most people would balk at that kind of isolation." Me? I felt a thrill run down my spine. Don't get me wrong, I'm not some antisocial hermit. But there's something about being out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, that speaks to my soul. "That's not a problem," I assured him. "In fact, it sounds perfect. When do you need me to start?" We hammered out the details over the next half hour. The pay was good, damn good actually, enough to set me up comfortably for the rest of the year if I played my cards right. Hawthorne emailed over the contract and some preliminary information about the tower's location and condition. As I hung up the phone, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and anticipation that always preceded a big job. But there was something else too, a faint uneasiness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to pre-job jitters. If I'd known then what I know now, well, let's just say I might have thought twice about accepting that contract. The next week was a flurry of activity. I had to gather supplies, check and double-check my equipment, and make arrangements for my absence. Living alone made that part easier. No family to worry about, no pets to find sitters for. Just me and my work. I pored over maps of the Siskiyou, tracing the winding forest roads that would lead me to my destination. The tower was situated on a ridge deep in the heart of the wilderness, overlooking miles of unbroken forest. The nearest town of any size was Grants Pass, a good 3-hour drive away in good conditions. As I packed my truck, I went through my mental checklist. Tools were the priority, of course, everything from basic hammers and saws to more specialized equipment for working on the tower's structure. Then came the essentials, enough non-perishable food to last me at least a month, a water filtration system, first aid supplies, warm clothing, and sturdy boots. I also threw in some creature comforts, a few good books, my old acoustic guitar, and a portable radio. The lack of cell service meant I'd be cut off from the outside world, but I figured I could at least pick up some AM stations on a clear night. The night before I was set to leave, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the pile of maps and documents spread out before me. Something about this job felt different. I'd done plenty of remote work before, but this felt like I was preparing to step off the edge of the world. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. "Get it together, Dalton," I muttered to myself. "It's just another job. You've done this 100 times. But as I climbed into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this time things were going to be different. If only I'd known how right I was. I set out at dawn, the first rays of sunlight just beginning to peek over the horizon as I pulled out of my driveway. The streets of Portland were quiet, the city still half asleep. As I merged onto I-5 South, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This was where I belonged, on the road, heading towards adventure. The drive took me through the heart of Oregon, past rolling hills and dense forests. As I traveled further south, the landscape began to change. The terrain grew more rugged, the trees taller and more ancient. By the time I reached Grants Pass, it was late afternoon. I decided to spend the night there, knowing that the real challenge would begin the next day. The motel I checked into was nothing fancy, just a place to rest my head. As I lay in bed that night, I could hear the faint sound of traffic from the nearby highway. It would be the last time I'd hear that sound for a while. The next morning, I was up before sunrise, eager to get on the road. I stopped at a local diner for breakfast, savoring what would likely be my last hot meal for some time. The waitress, a friendly middle-aged woman named Betty, asked where I was headed. "Out to the Siskiyou," I told her. "Got a job restoring an old fire lookout tower." Betty's smile faltered for just a moment. "The Siskiyou? That's awful remote country. You be careful out there, honey. Those woods, well, let's just say they've got their secrets." I laughed it off at the time, but her words would come back to haunt me later. As I left Grants Pass behind, the roads became narrower, twisting through the mountains like veins. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to rough dirt tracks. My truck, trusty as it was, groaned and rattled as I navigated the increasingly treacherous terrain. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees here were giants, their branches forming a canopy so dense that at times it felt like twilight, even in the middle of the day. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Just when I was starting to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn, I saw it. The fire lookout tower rose above the treetops, a solitary sentinel against the sky. My destination, my home for the next month or more. As I pulled up to the base of the tower, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The structure looked even more dilapidated up close, weathered wood, missing shingles, windows clouded with years of grime. But there was also a strange beauty to it, a testament to human perseverance in the face of nature's relentless assault. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my stiff muscles. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp mountain air. "Well," I said aloud, my voice sounding oddly small in the vast wilderness, "guess it's time to get to work." Little did I know the real work and the real terror was yet to begin. The first few days at the tower were a blur of activity. I started by assessing the damage, making lists of repairs needed and prioritizing the most critical tasks. The structure itself was sound, thankfully, but years of neglect had taken their toll. I began with the basics, patching the roof, replacing rotted boards, and clearing out years of debris that had accumulated inside. It was hard physical labor, but I reveled in it. There's something deeply satisfying about working with your hands, seeing tangible progress at the end of each day. The isolation didn't bother me at first. In fact, I found it invigorating. During my breaks, I'd stand on the tower's balcony, gazing out over the endless sea of green that stretched to the horizon. The view was breathtaking, miles of untouched wilderness, unmarred by any sign of human presence save for the tower itself. As the days passed, I settled into a routine. Up at dawn, work until dusk, with breaks for meals and the occasional exploration of the immediate area around the tower. In the evenings, I'd sit by my battery-powered lantern, reading or strumming quietly on my guitar. It was on the 5th night that I first noticed something off. I was sitting outside, enjoying the cool evening air and watching the stars come out. The night was clear, the Milky Way a brilliant swath across the sky. But as I sat there, I became aware of a strange silence. Now, anyone who spent time in the wilderness knows it's never truly silent. There's always something. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the call of night birds, the chirping of insects. But in that moment, everything went still. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert, my eyes strained against the darkness, trying to penetrate the wall of trees that surrounded the clearing. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from somewhere in the depths of the forest came a sound. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something in between. It was deep and guttural, filled with a primal rage that sent chills down my spine. As quickly as it had come, the sound faded away. Gradually, the normal nighttime noises of the forest resumed as if nothing had happened. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing more than a bear or a mountain lion, some normal, explainable animal. But deep down I knew better. Whatever had made that sound, it wasn't anything I'd encountered before, and somehow I knew it wasn't anything I wanted to encounter. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag inside the tower, I found myself listening intently to every creak and groan of the old structure. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, my dreams were filled with shadows and gleaming eyes watching me from the darkness. The incident with the strange sound shook me more than I cared to admit. For the next few days, I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor, as if staying busy could somehow keep the creeping unease at bay. But even as I repaired windows and reinforced support beams, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was about a week after that night that I made the discovery. I had decided to do some exploring, partly to gather more firewood, and partly to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear in these woods. I followed a faint trail that led away from the tower, down the ridge, and into a thicker stand of trees. The forest here was old, the kind of ancient growth that makes you feel small and insignificant. Massive trunks rose like pillars around me, their branches forming a cathedral ceiling high above. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick carpet of pine needles and moss. I had been walking for maybe an hour when I came across the old logging camp. It was little more than a clearing now, nature slowly reclaiming what man had abandoned. Rusted equipment lay scattered about, the skeletal remains of a small crane, the collapsed frame of what might have been a shed or small office. As I picked my way through the debris, a sense of unease began to grow. It wasn't just the eerie atmosphere of the abandoned camp. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and then I saw it. At first I thought it was just an oddly shaped depression in the soft earth, but as I knelt down to examine it more closely, my blood ran cold. It was a footprint, but unlike any I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. The shape was all wrong for a bear or any other animal I knew. It was elongated, almost human-like in its basic form, but the toes ended in what could only be described as claws. I stared at the print, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hoax, or maybe my imagination running wild after days of solitude. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew deep down that this was no trick of the light, no product of an overactive imagination. This was real, and whatever had made this print was out there, somewhere in these woods. I stood up slowly, suddenly acutely aware of my surroundings. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just moments ago, now felt oppressive. Shadows seemed to move at the corners of my vision. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I made my way back to the tower in a daze, my mind racing. What had I seen? What could possibly leave a track like that? And more importantly, was it still out there? As I climbed the steps to the tower's living quarters, I found myself glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous shape emerging from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the silent, watching forest. That night I double-checked every lock, every window. I placed my heaviest tools near my sleeping bag, though I knew deep down they'd be little use against whatever could leave a print like that. Sleep eluded me, and I lay awake for hours, straining my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and glowing eyes, always just out of sight, always watching, waiting. The days following my discovery at the logging camp were tense. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering back to that massive footprint. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every unexpected sound. I debated calling it quits, packing up and heading back to civilization, but something kept me there, a mixture of stubbornness, curiosity, and if I'm being honest, a hefty dose of pride. I wasn't about to let some unexplained footprint chase me away from a job. So I stayed, but I took precautions. I started carrying my hunting knife with me at all times, even when working on the tower. I set up some crude alarms around the perimeter of the clearing. Nothing fancy, just cans on strings that would rattle if anything large passed by. For a few days nothing happened. The forest remained quiet, almost unnaturally so. No more strange sounds, no more footprints. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I had overreacted, that the isolation was getting to me, making me see things that weren't there. And then came the afternoon that changed everything. I was at the base of the tower working on repairing one of the support beams. It was hot work, and I was focused intently on the task at hand. So focused that at first I didn't notice the silence that had fallen over the forest. It was the same unnatural quiet I'd experienced that night on the balcony. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I froze, the hammer still gripped tightly in my hand. Slowly I straightened up, every nerve in my body screaming danger. That's when I heard it. A loud crack from somewhere in the woods behind me, like a large branch snapping under immense weight. Then another, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Every instinct told me to run, to scramble up the tower to safety, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the tree line. And then it emerged. Even now, months later, I have trouble describing what I saw. It was like something out of a nightmare, a creature that shouldn't exist in our world. It looked vaguely canine, but that's where any resemblance to a normal animal ended. It stood on its hind legs, easily 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in shaggy dark fur, matted in places with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The face was a twisted mockery of a dog's, with a long snout filled with jagged, uneven teeth. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They glowed with an unnatural, sickly yellow light, filled with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. Those eyes locked onto me, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was being hunted. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. My mind was blank with terror, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, with a snarl that sounded almost like laughter, the creature dropped to all fours and charged. Instinct took over. I turned and ran, my legs pumping furiously as I sprinted towards the tower. The sound of crashing foliage behind me told me the creature was in pursuit, gaining ground with every second. I reached the ladder at the base of the tower and began to climb, my hands slipping on the rungs in my panic. Just as I thought I was going to make it, I felt something grab my ankle. Looking down, I saw the creature, its yellow eyes blazing with hunger and rage. Its claws dug into my flesh as it tried to drag me down. With a cry of pain and terror, I kicked out wildly. By some miracle, my boot connected with the creature's snout. It let out a yelp of pain and released me. I scrambled up the last few rungs and hauled myself onto the balcony, not daring to look back. I burst through the door of the tower, slamming it shut behind me and throwing the bolt. For several long moments I stood there, my back pressed against the door, gasping for breath. The tower creaked and swayed slightly in the wind, but there was no sound of pursuit. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain in my ankle made itself known. I looked down to see 4 deep gashes where the creature's claws had dug in. The wounds were bleeding freely, staining my boot and the floor beneath. With shaking hands, I managed to drag myself to the first aid kit and bandage the injury as best I could. All the while, I kept expecting to hear the creature trying to break down the door, to see its hideous face appear at one of the windows. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and my own ragged breathing. As night fell, I huddled in the center of the room, as far from the windows as I could get. I had my knife in one hand and a makeshift club in the other, a length of pipe I'd found among my tools. Not that I thought they'd do much good if that thing decided to come back. Sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the tower, every whisper of wind made me start, convinced that the creature was returning. I don't know how long I sat there, my eyes straining against the darkness, my ears alert for any sound out of place. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me, because the next thing I knew, watery daylight was filtering through the grimy windows. I blinked, disoriented, half convinced that the events of the previous day had been some sort of fever dream. But the throbbing pain in my ankle and the dried blood on my boot told me otherwise. It had been real. All of it. I approached one of the windows cautiously, peering out at the clearing below. There was no sign of the creature, no evidence of the chaos from the day before. Just the usual morning mist hanging between the trees. I knew I needed to get out of there. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, and I had no desire to have another encounter with it. But I was trapped. My truck was parked at the base of the tower, tantalizingly close yet impossibly far. There was no way I could make it down the ladder and to the vehicle before that creature caught up with me. So I waited. Hours crawled by as I sat in the tower watching the forest for any sign of movement. I rationed my remaining food and water, knowing I might be there for a while. My ankle throbbed, and I worried about infection setting in. It wasn't until the third day that I heard it, the distant sound of a helicopter. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that the isolation and fear had finally broken my mind. But as the sound grew louder, I realized it was real. I scrambled to the balcony, waving my arms frantically and shouting at the top of my lungs. The helicopter, a search and rescue craft, circled once, twice, and then began to descend into the small clearing next to the tower. As the rotors kicked up a whirlwind of leaves and debris, I saw two figures jump out and run towards the base of the tower. They were shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words over the noise of the helicopter. I practically fell down the ladder in my haste to reach them. As I stumbled towards the helicopter, supported by one of the rescue workers, I couldn't help but cast one last glance back at the tree line. And there, just for a moment, I saw it. A pair of sickly yellow eyes gleaming from the shadows, watching as I made my escape. Then they were gone, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined them. The trip back to civilization passed in a blur. I was taken to a hospital in Grants Pass, where my injuries were treated and I was checked for signs of exposure and dehydration. The official story was that I had been attacked by a bear, and in my shock and confusion, had been unable to call for help. I didn't bother trying to tell them the truth. Who would believe me? Some nights I'm not even sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw out there in the Siskiyou. I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely venture. I've since moved away from Oregon, taken up work in the city where the forests are kept at bay by concrete and steel. But sometimes on quiet nights I find myself looking out my window towards the distant mountains, and I wonder if somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, that creature is still roaming, still hunting. And I pray that no one else ever has to experience the terror I felt in those woods. It's been 5 years since my encounter in the Siskiyou National Forest. Life has, for the most part, returned to normal. I've settled into a routine, found steady work that keeps me far away from the deep woods. But the memories of those days in the tower still haunt me. I've done my research since then, digging into local legends and folklore. It turns out I'm not the first to have encountered something strange in those mountains. There are stories, whispered tales in bars, posts on obscure online forums of other sightings. A hiker who went missing for days, only to return babbling about a dog man. A group of campers who fled their site in the middle of the night, leaving all their gear behind. Most people dismiss these stories as tall tales, the product of overactive imaginations or too much time alone in the wilderness. But I know better. I've seen it with my own eyes, felt its claws on my skin. I've thought about going back, about trying to find proof of what I saw. But every time I consider it, I'm overwhelmed by a deep primal fear. Whatever that creature was, it was an apex predator, something that saw humans as nothing more than prey. To seek it out would be suicidal. So I stay away, and I warn others to do the same. If you find yourself in the deep woods, in those places where the shadows seem a little too dark and the silence a little too complete, be careful, be aware. And if you hear something moving in the undergrowth, something too big to be a normal animal, don't stick around to investigate. Run, and don't look back, because there are things out there in the wilderness, things that defy explanation, and not all of them are content to simply watch from the shadows. As for me, I've made my peace with what happened. I know that there are mysteries in this world that may never be solved, creatures that may never be explained. All I can do is live my life and hope that I never again have to face the terror that lurks in the deep woods of the Siskiyou. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whistles just right, I swear I can hear it, that low, guttural howl echoing from the distant mountains. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that somewhere out there the creature is still roaming, still hunting, still waiting, and I pray that our paths never cross again. The summer of 2018 was meant to be my fresh start. After 4 grueling years at Northwestern University in Chicago, I was burnt out and directionless. My name is Ewan McAllister, and at 22 I felt like I was already failing at adulthood. The thought of diving straight into a corporate job made my stomach churn. I needed something different, something to clear my head and help me figure out my next move. That's when my old high school buddy Rhett Lawson called with an offer that sounded too good to be true. His uncle Hank ran a fly fishing outfitter in Montana, and they needed extra hands for the summer season. "It's good money, man," Rhett said, his excitement palpable even over the phone. "Plus, you get to spend your days on some of the most beautiful rivers in the country. What do you say?" I didn't hesitate. A week later, I was throwing my duffel bag into the back of my beaten-up Subaru and hitting the road west. The drive from Chicago to Bozeman took nearly 24 hours, but as the urban sprawl gave way to rolling prairies and then the jagged peaks of the Rockies, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Hank's outfitter, Big Sky Flies and Guides, was tucked away in a narrow valley of the Gallatin National Forest, about an hour's drive from the nearest town of Willow Creek. As I navigated the winding dirt road leading to the property, the dense pine forest opened up to reveal a cluster of rustic log cabins nestled beside a swift-flowing river. The main lodge stood 2 stories tall, its wide porch offering a commanding view of the surrounding wilderness. Rhett was waiting for me on the porch, grinning ear to ear. He looked different from our high school days, tanner, more muscular, with a scruffy beard that made him look older than his 23 years. "Ewan, you made it," he called out, bounding down the steps to meet me. "How was the drive?" "Long," I admitted, stretching my stiff muscles, "but worth it. This place is incredible." Rhett laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. "Just wait until you see it at sunrise. Come on, I'll introduce you to the crew." Over the next hour, I met the rest of the Big Sky team. There was Hank, of course, a gruff, barrel-chested man in his early 60s with weathered hands and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Good to have you on board, Ewan," he said, his handshake firm. "Rhett says you're a quick study. You'll need to be." Then there were the other guides. Maggie, a wiry woman in her 30s who could cast a fly with surgical precision, and Wyatt, an older gentleman with a salt and pepper beard and a penchant for Johnny Cash tunes. "Welcome to paradise, kid," Wyatt drawled, tipping his well-worn Stetson. My living quarters for the summer turned out to be a small but cozy cabin on the edge of the property. It was sparse, just a bed, a dresser, and a tiny bathroom, but the window offered a stunning view of the river and the mountains beyond. That first week flew by in a blur of training and orientation. Mornings were spent learning the ins and outs of the outfitter business, how to prep gear, load drift boats, and tie the intricate flies that gave the shop its name. Afternoons found me on the river with Maggie or Wyatt, honing my casting technique and learning to read the water. "You're looking for seams," Maggie explained one day as we waded into the chilly current. "Places where fast water meets slow. That's where the big browns like to hang out." I nodded, trying to take it all in. The river was a living thing, I realized, with its own rhythms and secrets. Learning to fish it properly was like learning a new language. The work was physically demanding, but I found myself loving every minute of it. There was something deeply satisfying about collapsing into bed each night, muscles aching but mind clear. The constant background noise of the city that I'd grown so accustomed to was replaced by the gentle murmur of the river and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Evenings at Big Sky took on a comforting routine. After the clients had retired to their cabins, the staff would gather on the main lodge's porch. Hank would break out a cooler of local craft beers, and we'd swap stories as the sun dipped below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was during one of these evening sessions, about 2 weeks into my stay, that I first heard mention of something unusual in the woods. Wyatt was in the middle of recounting a particularly harrowing fishing trip when Maggie suddenly sat up straight, her eyes scanning the tree line. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. We all fell silent, straining to listen. For a moment, all I could hear was the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, faintly, I caught it, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Probably just a bear," Hank said dismissively, but I noticed his hand tighten on his beer bottle. "They've been getting bolder lately, coming down from the high country." Wyatt nodded sagely. "Happens every few years when the berry crop is poor. Nothing to worry about, long as we keep the trash locked up tight." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. That sound, it hadn't seemed quite right for a bear. There was something in its timbre, a hint of something almost human, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I made my way back to my cabin that night, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, peering into the shadows between the trees. The forest that had seemed so welcoming during the day now felt oppressive, full of hidden watchers. I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was just culture shock, city boy jitters at being surrounded by real wilderness for the first time. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin, I couldn't quite convince myself that was true. Little did I know that uneasy night was just the beginning. The true horrors that awaited us in those Montana woods were beyond anything I could have imagined. The next few weeks passed without incident, but that initial sense of unease never fully left me. I threw myself into the work, learning the intricacies of guiding and finding a rhythm to life at Big Sky. The days were long but rewarding, filled with the satisfaction of helping clients land their first trout or teaching them to read the river. It was during this time that I grew closer to the team, especially Wyatt. The old-timer took me under his wing, regaling me with tales of his decades in the Montana wilderness. "You've got good instincts, kid," he told me one evening as we repaired some damaged fly rods. "You listen to those instincts out here. They might just save your life someday." I thought about asking him if he'd ever encountered anything unusual in these woods, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way his eyes would occasionally drift to the tree line, a flicker of something, wariness, fear, crossing his weathered face. It was early July when things started to change. The first incident was small, almost negligible. I was closing up the tackle shop one evening when I noticed muddy prints leading from the door to one of the equipment lockers. They weren't human, nor did they match any animal tracks I'd seen before. They were large, with what looked like elongated toes ending in sharp points. I mentioned it to Hank the next morning. He frowned, examined the now dry marks, and muttered something about "damn wolverines" before telling me to make sure everything was locked up tight from now on. A few days later, Maggie and I were guiding a father and son on a day trip down the river. As we rounded a bend, I spotted something on the far bank that made my blood run cold. It was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. The animal had been torn apart, its rib cage splayed open and spine snapped like a twig. "Jesus," Maggie whispered, quickly steering our boat away before the clients could get a good look. "I've never seen a kill like that before." That night, the atmosphere at our usual porch gathering was subdued. Nobody wanted to directly address what was happening, but I could see the worry etched on everyone's faces. Hank started carrying his rifle whenever he went to check the outlying cabins. Rhett, usually the life of our little party, grew quiet and jumpy. The defining moment came about a week later. I was having trouble sleeping and decided to take a short walk to clear my head. The night was cool and clear, a full moon casting long shadows across the clearing. As I approached the edge of the woods, I heard it, that same low, rumbling growl I'd heard weeks ago, but closer now, much closer. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned towards the sound. There, just within the tree line, I saw two glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. They were set too high for a bear or a mountain lion, and as my eyes adjusted, I could make out a massive, hulking shape. For a split second, the creature shifted, and I saw it clearly in the moonlight. It stood on two legs, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and human, with a long snout filled with gleaming teeth. but it was the eyes that truly terrified me. There was an intelligence there, a malevolent awareness that no animal should possess. I don't remember running back to my cabin. The next thing I knew, I was huddled in my bed, doors locked and curtains drawn, shaking uncontrollably. When morning came, I half convinced myself it had been a nightmare. But the muddy, elongated footprint outside my cabin door told a different story. I pulled Rhett aside that day and told him everything. To my surprise, he didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, his face went pale. "You're not the first to see it," he said quietly. "Uncle Hank. He's known about it for years. It's why he started this place, to keep an eye on it. But it's never been this bold before." Over the next few days, a plan formed. Hank called a meeting, finally laying out the truth to all of us. The creature, he called it a dogman, though that term seemed woefully inadequate, had been a part of local legend for generations. Normally, it kept to the deep wilderness, but something had drawn it closer to civilization this summer. "We need to drive it back," Hank explained, his voice grim. "For good this time." The plan was simple, if terrifying. We would set up bait at the far end of the valley, then use a series of coordinated noises and lights to herd the creature deeper into the wilderness, away from our outfitter and the nearby towns. It was risky, but we all agreed it was necessary. The night of our plan arrived, clear and moonlit. We split into teams, each armed with powerful flashlights, air horns, and for Hank and Wyatt, high-powered rifles. I was paired with Rhett, stationed near the river where we'd create a barrier of sound and light. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just as the false dawn was beginning to lighten the sky, we heard it, a bone-chilling howl that echoed through the valley. It was answered by another howl, then another. There wasn't just one creature out there. What followed was chaos. Our carefully laid plan fell apart as multiple dogmen emerged from the woods. I caught glimpses of them loping between the trees, far faster and more agile than anything that size should be. In the confusion, I lost track of Rhett. Panic set in as I heard screams and gunshots echoing through the woods. I ran, my only thought to get back to the relative safety of the main lodge. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, only to come face to face with one of the creatures. It towered over me, saliva dripping from its razor-sharp teeth. I was certain I was about to die. Then Wyatt was there, his rifle blazing. The creature howled in pain and fury, swiping at the old man with claws the size of steak knives. I watched in horror as Wyatt was knocked to the ground. What happened next is a blur. Somehow I got hold of Wyatt's fallen rifle. The creature turned towards me and I fired again and again until the gun clicked empty. The dogman stumbled, then collapsed, its massive body shuddering once before going still. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. Our outlying cabins were destroyed, deep claw marks scoring the logs, but miraculously everyone had survived. Wyatt was badly injured and Maggie had a broken arm, but we were alive. As for the creature I'd shot, its body dissolved into a foul-smelling black ooze within hours, leaving no evidence behind. In the days that followed, we did our best to clean up and make sense of what had happened. Hank made some calls, and soon government types in unmarked vehicles arrived, asking questions and taking samples. We were all sworn to secrecy, told that revealing what we'd seen would result in severe consequences. The outfitter was shut down, permanently. We all went our separate ways, carrying the weight of our shared secret. I tried to move on, to forget, but the memory of those glowing eyes and that inhuman howl haunts me still. Sometimes on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself wondering if they're still out there, those impossible creatures. And I wonder if, someday, they might come looking for the humans who dared to fight back. Every now and then, I get a postcard from Rhett or Wyatt. No words, just a picture of some remote mountain landscape. I understand the message. We're keeping watch. And I know that if the day comes when I receive a blank postcard, it'll be time to return to Montana, to face the horrors that lurk in those deep, dark woods once more. For now, I live with the knowledge that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people could ever imagine. And I sleep with a loaded rifle by my bed, always listening for that low, rumbling growl in the night. It was late autumn when I found myself driving north on I-93, the colorful New Hampshire foliage a stark contrast to the gray clouds hanging low in the sky. The steady hum of my old pickup truck's engine was a familiar comfort as I tried to sort through the mess my life had become. Just a week earlier, I'd been laid off from my construction job in Boston, another victim of the economic downturn that had been sweeping through the industry. At 32, I felt like I was starting over. No job, no real prospects, and a gnawing sense of uncertainty about my future. That's when my buddy Bryson came through with an offer I couldn't refuse. His aunt owned some property up in the White Mountains near the New Hampshire-Maine border, and she was looking for someone to help out around the place for a while. Free room and board in exchange for some manual labor. It sounded perfect, a chance to clear my head, figure out my next move, and put some distance between myself and the city that suddenly felt suffocating. As I crossed into New Hampshire, the landscape began to change. The highways and suburbs gave way to winding country roads and dense forests. I found myself relaxing a bit, the weight of my recent troubles seeming to lift with each mile that separated me from Boston. It was early evening when I finally turned onto the long, winding dirt road that led to Bryson's aunt's property. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the fading daylight. The isolation of the place hit me immediately. I hadn't passed another car in at least 20 minutes, and my cell phone had long since lost any hint of a signal. After what felt like an eternity of bumping along the rutted path, I finally caught sight of a clearing ahead. As I pulled into the open space, I got my first real look at what would be my home for the foreseeable future. The centerpiece was a sturdy log cabin, its weathered timbers speaking to decades of standing strong against the harsh New England winters. Off to one side stood a large barn, its red paint faded but still cheerful against the backdrop of towering pines. A well-tended vegetable garden stretched out behind the cabin, and I could see a chicken coop tucked away near the edge of the clearing. As I climbed out of my truck, stretching my stiff muscles, the front door of the cabin swung open. A woman who could only be Bryson's Aunt Rowan stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was shorter than I'd expected, with long gray hair pulled back in a braid and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take my measure in an instant. "You must be Liam," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "Bryson said you'd be getting in around now. Hope the drive wasn't too bad." I made my way over to the porch, extending my hand. "Yes, ma'am, that's me. Thanks again for having me out here. The drive was fine, just longer than I'm used to these days." Rowan's handshake was firm, her palms calloused from what I assumed was years of working the land. She gave me a quick once-over, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with what she saw. "Well, you look like you can handle your share of work, that's for sure. Come on in, I've got some stew on the stove. We can talk about what needs doing while we eat." As I followed Rowan into the cabin, I was struck by how lived-in and comfortable it felt. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, a crackling fire already burning within. Bookshelves lined one wall, stuffed to bursting with well-worn volumes on everything from gardening to local history. The furniture was all sturdy, handcrafted pieces that looked like they'd been around for generations. The smell of the stew hit me as soon as we entered, and my stomach growled in response. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until that moment. Rowan gestured for me to take a seat at the heavy wooden table while she bustled about, ladling stew into bowls and cutting thick slices of homemade bread. As we ate, Rowan filled me in on the property and what she expected from me. The place had been in her family for generations, she explained, and she'd taken it over about 15 years ago, after deciding city life wasn't for her anymore. "It's not an easy life out here," she said, her eyes serious. "But it's a good one if you're willing to put in the work. We're pretty self-sufficient. Got the garden, the chickens, some beehives out back. I do a bit of foraging too when the season's right." I nodded, taking in the information. "Sounds like my kind of place," I said. "I've always enjoyed working with my hands, being outdoors." Rowan seemed pleased by this. Good. There's always plenty to do around here. Wood to chop, fences to mend, that sort of thing. The barn needs a new coat of paint come spring, and I wouldn't say no to some help expanding the garden." As we finished our meal, Rowan gave me a quick tour of the cabin. My room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed and a dresser for my things. A window looked out over the back of the property, giving me a view of the dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was exactly the change I'd been looking for, a chance to reset and figure out my next move. But there was something about the sheer isolation of the place that set me on edge. The darkness outside my window seemed absolute, broken only by the faint light of stars peeking through the trees. I drifted off to sleep eventually, my dreams filled with shadowy forests and the sensation of being watched. The next few days passed in a blur of physical labor and adjusting to the rhythm of life on Rowan's homestead. I threw myself into the work, grateful for the distraction and the bone-deep tiredness that came with a day of honest toil. Rowan proved to be a patient teacher, showing me the ins and outs of caring for the chickens, tending the garden, and the myriad other tasks that kept the place running. It was on my 4th day there that I first noticed something odd. I was out chopping wood near the barn when I heard Rowan's voice coming from the direction of the chicken coop. This wasn't unusual in itself. She often talked to the chickens as she went about her chores. But this time her tone caught my attention. She sounded agitated, almost argumentative. Curious, I set down my axe and made my way closer, trying to catch what she was saying. As I approached, I could make out snatches of her one-sided conversation. "Don't you start with that nonsense again," she was saying, her voice low and intense. "I've told you before, it's not real. It can't be real." There was a pause, filled only with the soft clucking of the chickens. Then Rowan's voice again, even more agitated than before. "No, absolutely not. I won't hear another word about it. You're just spooked by the coyotes, that's all it is." I stepped around the corner of the coop, clearing my throat to announce my presence. Rowan whirled around, her face flushed and her eyes wide. For a moment she looked almost frightened, but she quickly composed herself. "Oh, Liam," she said, forcing a smile, "I didn't hear you come up. Everything all right?" I hesitated, unsure how to broach what I'd overheard. "Yeah, everything's fine. I heard you talking. Is everything okay with the chickens?" Rowan waved a hand dismissively, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Oh, they're fine. Just a bit nervous lately, probably a fox or something sniffing around." I nodded, not entirely convinced, but not wanting to push the issue. "Well, let me know if you need any help setting some traps or anything." "Thanks, Liam. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." With that, she hurried off towards the cabin, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying the incident in my mind. There was something about Rowan's reaction that didn't sit right with me. It was more than just embarrassment at being caught talking to chickens. There had been real fear in her eyes, if only for a moment. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I was reading too much into things. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me from just beyond the edge of the forest. The next few days passed without incident, and I began to think I'd imagined the whole thing. The work kept me busy, and I found myself settling into the routine of life on the homestead. There was something deeply satisfying about the simplicity of it all. Waking with the sun, working with my hands all day, and falling into bed exhausted but content. It was about a week after the incident with the chickens that things took a turn for the strange. I was out near the barn, splitting logs for the coming winter, when a smell hit me that nearly made me gag. It was a stench of decay, thick and cloying, like something had died and been left to rot in the summer heat. I looked around, trying to find the source of the smell, when I heard a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a scrabbling noise, like claws on wood, coming from inside the barn. My heart pounding, I took a cautious step towards the barn door, which stood slightly ajar. Before I could reach it, something burst out of the gap. At first, all I registered was a blur of movement, something large and dark, moving with a loping gait that seemed all wrong. It was gone in an instant, disappearing into the tree line before I could get a proper look. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. It had been too big to be a coyote or a fox, but it moved nothing like a bear. And that smell, I'd never encountered anything like it before. When I finally regained my composure, I approached the barn cautiously, half expecting to find some gruesome scene inside. But there was nothing. No signs of disturbance, no lingering smell. If it weren't for the racing of my heart, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That evening, as Rowan and I sat down to dinner, I decided to bring up what I'd seen. As I described the incident, I watched her face carefully. At first, she tried to brush it off, suggesting it might have been a bear or even just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I pressed on, describing the unnatural way the creature had moved and the horrific smell, I saw something change in her expression. "Liam," she said, her voice low and serious, "there are stories about these woods, old stories passed down by the locals for generations. Most people dismiss them as fairy tales or campfire ghost stories, but—" She trailed off, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. I leaned in, my curiosity piqued. "But what, Rowan? What kind of stories?" Rowan sighed, suddenly looking much older than her years. "They talk about something that lives in the deepest parts of the forest, something that's not supposed to exist. The old-timers call it the Wendigo, but that's just one name for it. It's said to be a creature of insatiable hunger, always hunting, always killing." I felt a chill run down my spine as she spoke. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss it as local superstition, but the memory of that thing I'd seen, the wrongness of its movement, was too fresh in my mind. Have you ever seen it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rowan shook her head. "No, not directly, but there have been times when I felt something watching me from the trees, times when I found animals killed in ways no natural predator would, and the chickens, they always know when it's near." The pieces started to fall into place. Rowan's argument with the chickens, her fear when I'd overheard her. It all suddenly made a twisted kind of sense. "What do we do?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Rowan met my eyes, her gaze steely. "We stay vigilant. We don't go into the woods alone, especially not at night, and we hope that it stays away." As I lay in bed that night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. Little did I know this was only the beginning of the terror that awaited me in those mountains. The days that followed were filled with a constant, gnawing tension. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, every shadow potentially hiding something sinister. Rowan and I fell into a routine of checking and double-checking the property's perimeter, always on guard for any sign of the creature's return. One evening, about 2 weeks after my initial encounter, I was helping Rowan secure the chicken coop for the night. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, but the beauty was lost on us as we worked in tense silence. Suddenly, a cacophony of panicked squawking erupted from inside the coop. The chickens were in a frenzy, their cries piercing through the quiet evening air. Rowan and I exchanged a look of alarm before rushing to investigate. As we approached, the noise abruptly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more unsettling. I reached for the coop door with trembling hands, bracing myself for what we might find inside. The sight that greeted us turned my stomach. Feathers were strewn everywhere, and blood spattered the walls and floor. But it was the empty spaces that truly chilled me to the bone. Several chickens were missing, with no sign of how they had been taken. Rowan's face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's getting bolder," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's never come this close to the house before." We spent the rest of the evening in a state of high alert, armed with whatever makeshift weapons we could find, an axe for me, a shotgun for Rowan. But nothing else happened that night, leaving us exhausted and on edge. The next morning, driven by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, I decided to follow the trail of destruction into the woods. Rowan protested vehemently, but I was determined. I needed to see for myself, to try and make sense of what we were dealing with. Armed with a hatchet and my wits, I set out just after dawn. The forest was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual morning birdsong. I followed a faint trail of broken underbrush and occasional feathers, my heart pounding with each step deeper into the woods. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I came upon a small clearing. The sight that greeted me there will haunt me for the rest of my days. At first glance, it looked like a bear, reared up on its hind legs. But as my eyes adjusted to the dappled forest light, I realized how horribly wrong that assessment was. The creature before me was impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its body was covered in thick matted black fur, but patches of sickly pale skin showed through in places. And then it turned, and I saw its face. The snout was elongated, filled with rows of sharp yellowed teeth, but it was the eyes that truly paralyzed me with fear. They were a sickly yellow color, with vertical pupils like a cat's, and they held an intelligence, a malevolent, hungry intelligence that no animal should possess. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a stare-down. I was frozen, not by fear alone, but by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. My mind rebelled against the reality before me, desperately trying to rationalize it as anything other than what it was. Then, with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, it opened its mouth and let out a bone-chilling snarl. The spell was broken, and survival instinct kicked in. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going, driven by pure adrenaline. I don't know how long I ran, or how I managed to find my way back to the cabin. When I burst out of the tree line, gasping for air and wild-eyed, Rowan was there on the porch, shotgun in hand. She took one look at me and knew. "You saw it," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, still struggling to catch my breath. We have to leave," I managed to gasp out. "It's not safe here." Rowan's face hardened. "This is my home," she said firmly. "I'm not abandoning it because of something in the woods." But I could see the fear in her eyes, could hear the slight tremor in her voice. She was putting on a brave face, but she was just as terrified as I was. We spent that night huddled in the cabin, every light blazing, jumping at every sound. Neither of us slept. As dawn broke, I made my decision. I couldn't stay here, couldn't face the constant fear and the knowledge of what lurked in those woods. With a heavy heart, I packed my things. Rowan tried to convince me to stay, but I could see the relief in her eyes when I insisted on leaving. As I loaded up my truck, she pressed a small object into my hand, a charm of some sort, made of twisted wire and what looked like animal bones. "For protection," she said simply. "And Liam, be careful out there. It's not just these woods. There are things out there that most people don't know about, things that shouldn't exist but do." I nodded, a lump in my throat. Despite everything, I'd grown fond of Rowan in this place. But the memory of those yellow eyes, that twisted form, was too much to bear. As I drove away, watching the cabin disappear in my rearview mirror, I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. I was leaving the immediate danger behind, but the knowledge of what I'd seen, what I now knew existed in the world, would stay with me forever. I drove for hours, not stopping until I hit the outskirts of Boston. The familiar sights and sounds of the city should have been comforting, but instead they felt somehow hollow. I knew now that beneath the veneer of normalcy there was a whole other world of ancient, terrifying things. In the years since, I've tried to move on. I went back to construction work, threw myself into city life. But there's always a part of me that remains on edge, always watching the shadows, always half expecting to see those yellow eyes staring back at me. Sometimes late at night, I find myself researching similar sightings, poring over old legends and folklore. I've connected with others who've had encounters they can't explain, swapped stories in hushed tones over drinks in dimly lit bars. And sometimes in my darkest moments I consider going back to those woods, back to Rowan's cabin, to find proof, to confront the thing that's haunted my nightmares for years. But then I remember the raw terror of that moment in the clearing, the primal wrongness of the creature, and I know I can never return. So I stay here, in the safety of the city, surrounded by the comforting illusion of a world that makes sense. But I never forget. And I always keep Rowan's charm close at hand, a constant reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the unwary to stumble into their domain. As for Rowan, I've tried to contact her a few times over the years, but I've never been able to reach her. Sometimes I wonder if she's still there, still holding her ground against the encroaching darkness. Other times I fear the worst. but mostly I try not to think about it at all, because thinking about it means remembering, and remembering means facing the truth that out there in the deep, dark woods of New Hampshire, something ancient and hungry is waiting, and it has yellow eyes. My name is Wilder, and I've always been drawn to the wild places of the world. As a wildlife photographer, I've made a career out of chasing that next perfect shot, often in some of the most remote and dangerous locations on Earth. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the Brooks Range of Alaska. It was late summer of 2021 when I received an assignment from National Geographic. They wanted a comprehensive photo essay on the wildlife of the Alaskan wilderness, with a particular focus on the more elusive creatures, wolves, lynx, and if I was lucky, maybe even a glimpse of the ever-mysterious wolverine. The pay was good, but more than that, it was the challenge that drew me in. I'd worked in Alaska before, but never this deep into the backcountry. I spent weeks preparing, poring over maps, studying wildlife patterns, and upgrading my gear. The Brooks Range is no joke. It's one of the most remote and unforgiving environments in North America. I knew I'd be pushing my limits, but that's always been where I've felt most alive. As my departure date approached, I found myself in Fairbanks, making final preparations. It was there, in a dimly lit bar that smelled of pine and old leather, that I first heard the whispers. I was nursing a beer, chatting with some of the locals about the best spots for wildlife viewing, when an old-timer at the end of the bar spoke up. "You heading up to the Brooks Range, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of harsh winters and cheaper whiskey. I nodded, feeling a spark of excitement. "That's right, hoping to get some shots of the local wildlife." The old man exchanged a look with the bartender, something unspoken passing between them. "You be careful up there," he said slowly. "There's things in those mountains that don't take kindly to visitors." I chuckled, used to the tall tales that often circulated in places like this. "Bears and wolves, you mean? Don't worry, I've got experience with—" "Not just bears and wolves," he cut me off, his rheumy eyes suddenly intense. "There's other things, things that ain't natural." The bartender cleared his throat. "Don't mind old Joe," he said with a forced laugh. "He's been telling stories like that for years. You'll be fine up there, just keep your wits about you." I nodded, but couldn't shake the chill that had settled over me. As I left the bar that night, the old man's words echoed in my head. I dismissed them as the ramblings of a local trying to scare the outsider, but looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect day for flying. I met my bush pilot, Harlan, at a small airstrip just outside of Fairbanks. He was a grizzled veteran of the Alaskan skies, with a weather-beaten face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You sure you want to go this deep in?" Harlan asked as we loaded my gear into his de Havilland Beaver. "It's no joke out there. Search and rescue response time is measured in days, not hours." I nodded, double-checking my satellite phone and emergency beacon. "I'm prepared, Harlan. This is the kind of shot I've been waiting for my entire career." He shrugged, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Your call. Just remember, the land up there doesn't care about your career. It'll kill you just as quick as look at you if you're not careful." The flight was breathtaking. We soared over endless expanses of taiga forest, winding rivers cutting silver paths through the green, and jagged snow-capped peaks piercing the sky. As we flew deeper into the range, signs of human habitation grew scarcer, until it felt like we were the only people left in the world. After about 3 hours, Harlan's voice crackled through my headset. "There's a good spot," he said, banking the plane slightly. "Nice valley, water source nearby, and some open areas for your tent. Plus, I've seen game moving through here before." I peered out the window, my heart racing with excitement. The valley was perfect, a winding river glinting in the sun, surrounded by dense forest, and overlooked by towering peaks. It was wild, pristine, and exactly what I was looking for. Harlan set the plane down on a gravelly stretch near the river, the water spraying as we taxied to a stop. As soon as the door opened, I was hit by the crisp, clean air and the utter silence of the wilderness. No car horns, no distant hum of civilization, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the gentle gurgle of the river. We unloaded my gear quickly, Harlan helping me set up my base camp, a sturdy four-season tent, my camera equipment, and enough supplies to last me for 3 weeks. As he prepared to leave, Harlan gave me a final, searching look. "You've got the sat phone?" he asked. I patted my pocket. "Right here, and the emergency beacon is in my pack." He nodded. "Good. I'll be back in 3 weeks unless I hear from you sooner. Don't take any unnecessary risks, Wilder. The photos aren't worth your life." As the sound of Harlan's plane faded into the distance, I was left truly alone. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the calls of ravens and the distant rush of the river. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. This was what I lived for, just me and the wild, my camera the only barrier between us. I spent the rest of that first day setting up camp properly, securing my food in bear-proof containers, and scouting the immediate area. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and purple, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was exactly where I was meant to be. If only I had known then what was waiting for me in the darkness of that remote valley. If only I had listened to the warnings. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths, and I was about to learn just how unforgiving the wilderness could be. The first week passed in a blur of activity. I fell into a routine quickly. Up before dawn to catch the golden hour light, setting up camera traps along game trails, and spending hours in makeshift blinds waiting for the perfect shot. The wildlife was abundant. I captured images of majestic caribou, a family of lynx moving silently through the underbrush, and even a massive grizzly fishing in the river. But it was the wolves I was really after. I'd seen signs of them, paw prints in the mud, scat along the trails, but they remained frustratingly elusive. Each night as I reviewed my photos, I felt a mix of excitement at what I'd captured and frustration at what still eluded me. It was on the 8th night that things began to change. I was sitting outside my tent enjoying a freeze-dried meal and watching the stars come out when I heard it, a long, mournful howl echoing across the valley. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, straining my ears. The howl came again, closer this time, and was joined by others. A whole pack, by the sound of it. Excitement surged through me. This was what I'd been waiting for. I grabbed my camera and night vision equipment, ready to try and catch a glimpse of the pack. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, another sound reached my ears, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not wolf or bear or any other animal I could identify. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for the first time since arriving in the valley I felt a flicker of fear. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly and lying awake for hours, listening to the strange calls echoing through the night. The next morning I convinced myself I had imagined it. The mind plays tricks in the wilderness, especially at night. I set out early, determined to find signs of the wolf pack I'd heard. What I found instead shook me to my core. About a mile from camp, in a muddy area near the river, I saw the tracks. At first glance, they looked like wolf prints, but as I knelt to examine them closer, my blood ran cold. They were huge, far larger than any wolf I'd ever encountered. And there was something else, something that didn't make sense. Some of the prints looked almost bipedal. I took photos, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. This wasn't normal. Everything I knew about wildlife biology told me this was impossible. Yet the evidence was right there in front of me. As I stood up, I felt it, that prickling sensation of being watched. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. Still the feeling persisted, and I hurried back to camp, checking over my shoulder every few steps. That night the howls came again, closer than before, and with them that same bone-chilling growl. I huddled in my tent, my rifle close at hand, wondering what the hell I had gotten myself into. Days passed and the sense of wrongness grew. I couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly observed, even when I was inside my tent. My sleep became fitful, plagued by nightmares of glowing eyes and twisted wolf-like shapes. I tried to focus on my work, but my hands shook when I adjusted my camera settings, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. The wildlife seemed to have vanished. No caribou, no bears, not even the small rodents that had been so prevalent in my first week. It was on the 12th day that I saw it for the first time. I was checking one of my camera traps deep in the forest when I heard a branch snap behind me. I whirled around, my heart in my throat, and caught a glimpse of something moving through the trees. It was large, that much I could tell, with shaggy dark fur, but its shape was all wrong. It moved on 2 legs with a strange loping gait, its arms too long, its head a twisted parody of a wolf's. For a moment our eyes met. Its were a sickly yellow, glowing with an unnatural light, and then it was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest. I ran back to camp, my mind reeling. What I had seen was impossible. It defied everything I knew about the natural world. Yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The howls were constant, surrounding my camp, and underneath them was that growl, closer now, almost taunting. I clutched my rifle, my fingers white-knuckled on the grip, and waited for dawn. When morning finally came, I emerged from my tent to find my camp in disarray. Something had been through my supplies, ripping open bags and scattering food. One of my camera traps had been torn from its mounting and was missing entirely. Fear warred with curiosity. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation, a bear perhaps, or even a particularly bold wolf. But deep down I knew that what I had seen in the forest was real, and it was stalking me. I should have called for extraction then, should have packed up and gotten the hell out of that valley. But my pride, my stubbornness, and yes, my curiosity kept me there. I was determined to get proof, to capture an image of whatever this creature was. So I stayed, setting up more camera traps, venturing out with my camera always at the ready. But as the days wore on, my fear grew. The creature, or creatures, for I was certain now there was more than one, grew bolder. I would wake to find fresh tracks circling my tent, mere inches from where I slept. My food supplies dwindled as they were repeatedly raided, and always that sense of being watched, those yellow eyes haunting my dreams and my waking hours alike. It all came to a head on what was supposed to be my final night in the valley. Harlan was due to pick me up the next morning, and I was both relieved and frustrated. I had amazing footage of conventional wildlife, but nothing concrete of the creatures that had been terrorizing me for weeks. As the sun began to set, I made a fateful decision. I would set up one last time in a small clearing not far from my camp. If the creatures came, I would be ready. I settled into my blind as darkness fell, my camera equipped with night vision, my rifle close at hand. The night was eerily still, no wind, no animal sounds, just oppressive silence. Hours passed, my eyes strained in the darkness, every shadow seeming to move, and then, just as I was considering packing it in, I heard it. That now familiar growl, so close it seemed to vibrate through my chest. I raised my camera, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. And there, at the edge of the clearing, it emerged. It was even more terrifying up close, 7 feet tall at least, with a body that seemed a horrific amalgamation of wolf and man. Its fur was matted and patchy, revealing grayish skin underneath. The face was the worst, elongated like a wolf's muzzle, but with an intelligence in those glowing yellow eyes that was all too human. I snapped photo after photo, my breath coming in short gasps. The creature's head snapped towards me, nostrils flaring. It had caught my scent. What happened next was a blur of terror and adrenaline. The creature charged, covering the distance between us with impossible speed. I scrambled out of the blind, firing my rifle wildly. I heard a yelp of pain, saw blood on its shoulder, but it didn't slow. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear it behind me, its breath hot on my neck. Somehow I made it back to my camp, diving into my tent and fumbling for the flare gun I kept for emergencies. The creature tore through the canvas like it was tissue paper. I caught a glimpse of slavering jaws, of claws reaching for me, and then I fired the flare directly into its face. The roar it let out was deafening, a sound of pain and rage that seemed to shake the very ground. It retreated, thrashing and howling back into the forest. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I grabbed my satellite phone with trembling hands and called Harlan, begging him to come immediately. I babbled about monsters and glowing eyes, my words tumbling over each other in my panic. To his credit, Harlan didn't question me. He promised to be there at first light and told me to hang tight. That final night was the longest of my life. I sat huddled in what remained of my tent, my rifle in my lap, jumping at every sound. The howls and growls surrounded me, but nothing approached. It was as if they were content to wait, knowing I was trapped. When Harlan's plane finally appeared in the sky, I nearly wept with relief. He landed on the river, and I sprinted to the plane, not even bothering to grab most of my gear. As we took off, I looked down at the valley, half expecting to see the creatures emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just the pristine wilderness I had come to photograph. Back in civilization, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I developed my photos with shaking hands, but to my horror, every shot of the creature was blurred beyond recognition. Whether it was my own terror affecting my skills or something about the creature itself, I couldn't say. I told my story to the authorities, to other photographers, to anyone who would listen. Most dismissed it as the hallucinations of a man pushed to the brink by isolation. Others suggested I had encountered a bear with mange, or perhaps a wolf driven mad by disease. But I know what I saw. Those eyes, that impossible shape, it haunts me still. I've been back to Alaska since then, but never to that particular valley. Sometimes I dream of returning, of finally getting the proof I need, but then I remember those yellow eyes, that bone-chilling howl, and I wake in a cold sweat. The wilderness holds secrets, some of which are perhaps best left uncovered. I went looking for the perfect shot, and instead found something that defies explanation. My experience in the Brooks Range changed me, showed me that there are things in this world that exist beyond the boundaries of our understanding. In the months following my return from Alaska, I struggled to come to terms with what I had experienced. The blurred photos, while useless as evidence, served as a constant reminder that what I had seen was real. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something ancient and terrible, something that was never meant to be discovered by modern eyes. I threw myself into research, poring over old legends and folklore of the region. I found whispered stories of shapeshifters, of creatures that walked the line between man and beast. The Inuit had tales of the Adlet, wolf-like creatures with the upper bodies of men. Further south, various Native American tribes spoke of skinwalkers, humans who could take on animal form. But none of these stories quite matched what I had seen. The creatures in the Brooks Range seemed older somehow, more primal, as if they were a missing link between myth and reality. I sought out experts in cryptozoology, folklore, and even evolutionary biology. Most dismissed me outright. A few listened with interest, but ultimately concluded that without concrete evidence, my story would remain just that, a story. The nightmares persisted. Night after night, I found myself back in that valley, pursued by glowing eyes and savage howls. I would wake drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of hot breath on the back of my neck lingering in the darkness of my bedroom. My work suffered. I found it hard to concentrate on mundane wildlife shots when I knew what was really out there. My editors noticed the change in my photos. They lacked the spark, the connection with nature that had once been my trademark. It was almost a year to the day after my encounter when I made the decision to go back. I knew it was risky, perhaps even foolish, but I couldn't shake the need for answers. This time I was prepared. I brought better cameras, motion-activated trail cams with infrared capabilities, and even a small drone for aerial reconnaissance. I also brought a partner, Dr. Elena Rossi, a biologist specializing in canine species who had been one of the few to take my story seriously. She was skeptical but open-minded, and more importantly, she was willing to venture into the wilderness with me. We set up camp in the same valley, though not in the exact location of my previous encounter. The familiar landscape sent chills down my spine, but having Elena there helped keep me grounded. For the first few days, everything was quiet. We documented the local wildlife, set up our high-tech camera traps, and explored the surrounding area. Elena was impressed by the biodiversity of the region, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. It was on the 5th night that things changed. We were huddled around our campfire when we heard it, that same haunting howl that had plagued my dreams for months. Elena's eyes widened, her scientific skepticism warring with the undeniable reality of what she was hearing. "That's not a normal wolf," she whispered, her voice tight with a mix of fear and excitement. Over the next few days, the encounters escalated. We found massive bipedal tracks near our camp. One of our camera traps was torn to shreds, its memory card missing. And always, that sense of being watched. Elena was transformed by the experience. Her initial skepticism gave way to a feverish excitement. She took samples of fur caught on tree bark, made plaster casts of the tracks, and stayed up late into the night analyzing our findings. "This could rewrite everything we know about species evolution," she said one night, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "If we could just get clear documentation." I should have recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same reckless curiosity that had driven me to stay during my first encounter. But I was caught up in her enthusiasm, in the vindication of having someone else witness what I had seen. It happened on our final night in the valley. We had packed up most of our gear, ready for extraction the next morning, but decided to set up one last blind near where I had my closest encounter the year before. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sound. Howls echoed from all directions, closer than ever before. Elena gripped my arm, her earlier excitement replaced by raw fear. "We should go back to camp," she whispered. I nodded, but as we turned to leave, a massive shape burst from the underbrush. It was one of them, over 7 feet tall, its body a nightmarish blend of wolf and man. Those same glowing yellow eyes fixed upon us with terrifying intelligence. Elena screamed. The sound seemed to trigger something in the creature. It lunged forward impossibly fast. I shoved Elena aside and raised my rifle, firing twice. The shots echoed through the valley, and the creature stumbled, dark blood matting its fur. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar of pain and rage that shook me to my core. I grabbed Elena's hand and we ran, crashing through the forest back towards our camp. I could hear it behind us, its labored breathing and the snap of branches as it gave chase. We burst into the clearing where our camp was set up, and I headed straight for the flare gun. But as I reached for it, I realized Elena wasn't with me. I turned to see her at the edge of the clearing, her camera raised, trying to get a shot of our pursuer. "Elena, no," I shouted, but it was too late. The creature exploded from the tree line, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. Elena managed one shot before it was on her. I fired the flare, the bright red light illuminating a scene of horror. The creature had Elena in its grasp, its claws raking across her body. Her screams cut off abruptly as it bit down on her throat. The flare's light glinted off its yellow eyes as it turned to face me. In that moment, looking into those eyes, I felt a sense of recognition, not of the creature itself, but of what it represented. This was nature at its most primal, its most unforgiving. This was the wilderness pushing back against human encroachment, against our arrogant belief that we could understand and control the natural world. I fired another flare directly at the creature. It released Elena's body and retreated into the forest, but not before I saw the intelligence in its eyes replaced by something else. Fear. Fear of the fire, of the light, fear of human technology. I wanted to run to Elena, but I knew it was too late. I could hear more howls approaching, and I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. I grabbed my emergency pack, Elena's camera, and ran for the river where we had arranged for our extraction. I don't remember much of the extraction. I have blurry memories of Harlan's plane, of babbling my story to him as we flew through the dawn light, of park rangers and police at the airfield, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief as I tried to explain what had happened. There was a search, of course. They found our camp torn to shreds. They found Elena's body, or what was left of it. The official report cited a bear attack. My insistence on bipedal wolf creatures was dismissed as trauma-induced delusion. Elena's camera became the subject of much debate. The photos she took in her final moments were blurred, indistinct. To most, they showed nothing more than a large, dark shape. But I knew what I had seen. In the years since, I've grappled with whether to share my story. I've been approached by cryptozoology shows, by documentary filmmakers promising to tell the truth. I've turned them all down. The truth, I've realized, is something fragile. In trying to drag it into the light, we risk destroying it. Those creatures, whatever they are, have survived by remaining hidden, by existing in the shadows of our understanding. I still work as a wildlife photographer, but I've never returned to the Brooks Range. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the wilderness, I feel a prickle on the back of my neck. I turn, half expecting to see glowing yellow eyes watching me from the shadows. They're still out there, I'm sure of it. Creatures that walk the line between myth and reality, between the world we know and the world we've forgotten. And perhaps that's where they should remain. Because in the end, I'm left with a chilling question. Did I truly escape, or did they simply let me go? A witness to carry their warning back to the world of men, a reminder that there are still wild places in this world, and wild things that will defend them. And on dark nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I wonder, if I listen closely enough, will I hear that bone-chilling growl once again? Call me Finn. This happened to me a few years back, just after I'd moved to Idaho for a park ranger job. I figured a career change was exactly what I needed after burning out in the corporate world. The fresh air, the open skies, the chance to immerse myself in nature. It was all part of my grand plan to get my life back on track. I still remember the day I arrived in Boise, my beat-up Subaru packed to the brim with camping gear and what remained of my city life. The air felt different here, crisper somehow, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. As I drove towards the ranger station for my orientation, the looming silhouette of the Sawtooth Range filled my windshield, a jagged promise of adventure on the horizon. The chief ranger, a weather-beaten man named Hank, greeted me with a firm handshake and a skeptical once-over. "City boy, huh?" he grunted, eyeing my pristine hiking boots and department store flannel. I nodded, trying not to let my nervousness show. "Well, the mountains will either make you or break you. We'll see which." Over the next few days, I underwent intensive training. Wilderness first aid, wildlife identification, search and rescue protocols. It was like drinking from a fire hose of information, but I soaked it all in eagerly, desperate to prove I belonged here. My first posting was way up in the Sawtooth Wilderness. Rugged, mountainous terrain, the kind that makes you feel tiny and inconsequential in the best possible way. They set me up in a remote cabin, a sturdy log structure that had stood against the elements for decades. My duties mostly involved trail maintenance, assisting the occasional lost hiker, and just keeping an eye on things in my assigned area. As Hank drove me up to my new home, he offered some parting advice. "Remember, Finn, out here you're not just watching the land's watching you too. Respect it, and you'll do fine." With that cryptic message, he left me alone in the vastness of the Idaho wilderness. Those first weeks were blissful. Every morning I woke to birdsong instead of traffic. I had a whole mountain range as my backyard and didn't see another human for days at a time. I threw myself into my work, clearing fallen trees from trails, updating weather stations, and cataloging plant species. In the evenings, I'd sit on my cabin's small porch, watching the alpenglow paint the distant peaks in shades of pink and gold. I felt alive in a way I never had before. The corporate rat race, with its endless meetings and office politics, seemed like a distant nightmare. Here my biggest concerns were making sure my solar panels were clean and my bear spray was within reach. I was living the dream I'd sold myself on: communion with nature, purpose in my work, and a sense of belonging to something greater than myself. But around the third weekend, things started to feel off. It began with the howl. I'd heard wolves before. Their call is mournful, kind of beautiful in its wildness. This was different, more drawn out, lower in pitch, almost guttural. And unlike a pack howl, it was just a single lonely cry echoing across the valley. The first time I heard it, I was sitting by my campfire, enjoying a cup of coffee in the last warmth of the day. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself scanning the tree line, suddenly aware of how small and exposed I was in the gathering twilight. I told myself it was probably just a particularly vocal wolf, maybe separated from its pack. But deep down, something about that howl felt wrong. I heard it again the next night, then the next, always just after sunset, always that same haunting, solitary cry. It seemed to be coming from different directions each time, as if whatever was making the sound was circling my cabin, testing the boundaries of my little sanctuary. Then came the sightings, just glimpses out of the corner of my eye at first, a large, dark shape moving between the trees, a flash of yellow in the twilight, always leaving me with the sense of being watched, observed by something that didn't want to be seen clearly. I told myself it must be an unusually bold lone wolf, or a trick of the light, my mind playing games in the long hours of solitude. I knew how isolation could affect the psyche. We'd covered that in training. But rational explanations did little to quell the growing unease that settled over me like a heavy blanket. I started taking my rifle with me on my daily patrols, something I'd rarely done before. I found myself jumping at small sounds, peering into the shadows beneath the pines, always half expecting to see. What? I couldn't even articulate what I was afraid of, and that made the fear all the more potent. One morning, about a week after the howling began, I was hiking a high-altitude trail, checking for any damage from a recent thunderstorm. The air was crisp, the sky that impossible shade of blue you only get at elevation. I should have been reveling in the beauty around me, but instead I felt on edge, hyper-aware of every snapping twig and rustling leaf. That's when I spotted the tracks. At first I thought they must belong to a bear, but as I crouched down to examine them more closely, my blood ran cold. They were too big to be a cougar, and the claw marks were all wrong for a bear, retractable like a big cat's. But the stride was all wrong. These tracks were bipedal. Whatever made them walked upright, like a human. My pulse quickened as I stared at the impressions in the soft earth. Part of me, the rational, trained part, knew I should document this, take photos, maybe make a plaster cast. But a more primal instinct was screaming at me to turn around, to get as far away from these tracks as possible. I wish I'd listened to that instinct. I wish I'd packed it in right then and radioed for an extraction. But driven by a mix of curiosity and a stubborn refusal to let fear dictate my actions, I kept following the tracks. They led me off the main trail, winding through dense underbrush and over lichen-covered boulders. With each step, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if the very trees were holding their breath in anticipation. The tracks led down into a densely forested ravine, the kind of place where the sunlight barely penetrates the canopy. As I picked my way carefully down the slope, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched, that I had stepped into something's territory, something that didn't welcome my presence. That's when I saw it. Hunched between the trees, partially obscured by shadow, was a form that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall even in its crouched position. The body was powerfully built, covered in shaggy, dark fur. But it was the face that sent ice through my veins. It was wolfish in overall shape, but elongated, almost like a bizarre fusion of wolf and bear. The teeth, what I could see of them, were far too long and flat for any canine I'd ever encountered. And then its eyes met mine, those yellow eyes filled with a cold intelligence that made my skin crawl. There was nothing animal in that gaze. It was calculating, assessing. In that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that should not exist, something that straddled the line between myth and nightmare. Paralysis set in for a few heartbeats, my body frozen in primal terror. Then, mercifully, survival instinct kicked in. I turned and ran, tearing back up the ravine, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and the rocks that threatened to turn an ankle. I ignored the burning in my lungs and the way my legs trembled with each frantic step. The thing, I couldn't bring myself to name it, didn't pursue me immediately, but I felt its eyes boring into my back every step of the way, as if it was content to let me flee, knowing it could run me down at its leisure. I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin, slamming the door behind me and fumbling with shaking hands to slide the heavy wooden bar into place. Only then, gasping for breath and feeling my heart hammer against my ribs, did I allow myself to process what I'd seen. But even as I tried to rationalize the encounter, to find some explanation that fit within the boundaries of the world as I understood it, a part of me knew. Something ancient and terrible roamed these mountains. And now it knew I was here. I barricaded myself in my cabin that night, rifle at my side, heart pounding like a trapped rabbit. Every creak of the log walls, every whisper of wind through the pines outside, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. I tried to radio headquarters, but all I got was static, whether from equipment failure or something more sinister I couldn't say. As darkness fell, the sounds began. At first, it was just rustling outside the windows, so faint I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. But then came the scratching, unmistakable claws raking against the wooden walls of the cabin. Heavy footsteps circled the perimeter, pausing occasionally as if testing for weaknesses. I sat in the darkness, my back pressed against the wall furthest from the door, rifle clutched to my chest. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I found myself straining to hear any hint of the creature's movements over the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. Then suddenly, silence. The footsteps ceased. The scratching stopped. For a moment I dared to hope that whatever was out there had lost interest, had moved on to easier prey. That hope was shattered by a blood-curdling howl, loud enough to rattle the windows and shake dust from the rafters. It was the same haunting cry I'd heard on those previous nights, but 100 times more terrifying now that I knew the source. The sound seemed to go on forever, filled with a mixture of rage and, was that hunger? When it finally ended, the silence that followed was somehow even worse. I knew the thing was still out there, waiting, watching. I imagined those yellow eyes peering through the cracks between the logs, calculating its next move. I barely slept that night. Each time I started to drift off, exhaustion finally overcoming terror, I jolt awake, imagining the crash of splintering wood and those eyes gleaming in the darkness. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute an eternity of held breath and straining ears. Finally, mercifully, dawn began to creep over the mountains. As the first pale light filtered through the cabin's small windows, the oppressive feeling of being watched began to lift. Still, I waited, rifle ready, until the sun was fully up before I dared to move. Cautiously, I approached the door, every muscle tense as I slid back the bar and cracked it open. I peered outside, half expecting to see a scene of destruction, claw marks gouged into the walls, the surrounding forest torn apart in the creature's fury. But there was nothing. The clearing around my cabin looked exactly as it had the day before. No tracks in the dirt, no broken branches, not a single sign that anything unusual had happened during the night. For a moment, the perfect normalcy of the scene made me question my own sanity. Had I imagined it all? Was the stress and isolation finally getting to me? But then I saw it, a single long hair caught on a splinter in the doorframe, dark and coarse, too long to belong to any animal that should be in these mountains. With shaking hands I plucked it free and held it up to the morning light. It was undeniable proof that something had been here, that I hadn't hallucinated the entire ordeal. My mind started its familiar cycle of self-doubt and rationalization. Maybe it was just a particularly aggressive bear, driven to unusual behavior by hunger or illness. Or perhaps I had stumbled upon some unknown species, something science hadn't catalogued yet. The alternative, that I had encountered something truly outside the realm of natural explanation, was too terrifying to contemplate. I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it knew where I lived now. It had my scent, had marked me as prey, and I had no illusions about my chances if it decided to press its attack. With hands that still trembled slightly, I reached for the Ranger radio. I had to get out of here, had to report what I'd seen. But as I keyed the mic, I hesitated. How could I possibly explain this without sounding completely unhinged? In the end, I decided to play it safe. I contacted headquarters, told them about the howls, the tracks, and played it all down, making it sound like I was worried about a possible aggressive wolf, not some thing I couldn't even bring myself to name. I mentioned the sleepless night, implied that the isolation might be getting to me a bit. The other rangers, bless them, decided to send an extraction chopper. Whether they genuinely bought my story about an unusually bold wolf or just recognized the panic underlying my carefully measured words, I'll never know. But they agreed to pull me out for a few days of R&R while they sent a more experienced team to investigate. As I waited on a nearby ridge for the chopper, my eyes darted constantly to the tree line, expecting the creature to come crashing through at any moment. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent my heart racing. I clutched my rifle, knowing deep down it would be useless against that thing if it decided to attack, but drawing some small comfort from its familiar weight. The sound of rotors in the distance was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. As the chopper appeared over the ridge, a wave of relief washed over me so intense it made my knees weak. I scrambled towards the landing zone, wanting nothing more than to put as much distance between myself and these mountains as possible. As I climbed aboard, I couldn't help but take one last look at the forest below. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of movement among the trees, a flash of yellow eyes watching my escape. But then we were lifting off, the ground falling away as we rose into the clear blue sky. I've never felt relief like I did in that moment, watching the sawtooth wilderness shrink beneath us. But even as we flew toward civilization, a part of me knew this wasn't over. I had seen something out there, something that defied explanation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. Back at Ranger headquarters, I filed a full report, trying to strike a balance between accuracy and not sounding like I'd completely lost my mind. I included everything: the howls, the tracks, the sightings, even a rough sketch of the creature I'd seen in the ravine. As I spoke, I could see the skepticism in my colleagues' eyes, could practically hear them making mental notes about stress and isolation-induced hallucinations. To their credit, they took my report seriously, at least on the surface. They nodded in all the right places, asked appropriate follow-up questions, but I could tell they were humoring me, treating me with the gentle caution reserved for someone they believed to be on the edge of a breakdown. "Look, Finn," Hank said after I'd finished my account, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We've all heard stories. Hell, the locals have been talking about something they call a dogman for generations, but no one's ever found any real evidence." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd seen was real, but the words died in my throat. How could I expect them to believe me when I was still struggling to believe it myself? In the harsh light of day, surrounded by the comforting normality of the ranger station, my encounter seemed more and more like a bad dream. They gave me a week's leave, strongly suggesting I use the time to decompress and get my head straight. I nodded, grateful for the break but frustrated by their thinly veiled skepticism. As I left the station, I overheard two of the younger rangers whispering, catching phrases like "rookie mistake" and "just spooked himself." I spent that week in a fog, alternating between convinced certainty of what I'd experienced and crippling self-doubt. I'd wake up in cold sweats, the memory of those yellow eyes boring into me. But then I'd rationalize, tell myself it was just an unusually large wolf, my mind filling in the gaps with details born of fear and isolation. I tried to distract myself, to reacclimate to civilization. I went to movies, ate at crowded restaurants, anything to surround myself with the comforting buzz of humanity. But even in the heart of Boise, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once I caught myself scanning rooftops and alleyways, half expecting to see a hulking, fur-covered shape lurking in the shadows. As my leave drew to a close, I faced a decision. I could request a transfer, maybe to a more populated area with less wilderness. Part of me longed for the safety of park trails and picnic areas, but a larger part rebelled against the idea of running away. I had come to Idaho for a fresh start, to challenge myself. Was I really going to let one unexplained experience, terrifying as it was, derail everything? In the end, stubbornness won out. I returned to duty, albeit with a request to be stationed in a different part of the Sawtooth National Forest. Hank seemed relieved when I showed up, as if he'd half expected me to quit entirely. He assigned me to a cabin closer to one of the more popular camping areas, a compromise between my desire to prove myself and the administration's obvious concern for my mental state. "Just take it easy," Hank advised as he handed me my new post assignment. "Radio in every evening, and don't hesitate to call for backup if anything seems off." The subtext was clear: don't go chasing shadows or imaginary monsters. My new cabin was a far cry from the isolated outpost where I'd had my encounter. This one was within easy hiking distance of a well-trafficked campground, the constant murmur of vacationing families a reminder that I wasn't alone out here. For the first few weeks, that background noise was comforting, but as time passed, I found myself longing for the deep silence of the true wilderness. I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor, determined to prove to myself and others that I could handle the job. I led nature walks, helped maintain trails, and assisted campers with everything from bear safety to leave-no-trace principles. On the surface, I was the model of a competent, level-headed park ranger, but at night, when the campfires died down and the forest grew still, the memories would come flooding back. Every distant howl, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. I took to sleeping with my rifle propped against the bedside table, a habit that drew concerned looks from my fellow rangers on the rare occasions they visited my cabin. As summer waned and the nights grew longer, and restlessness began to gnaw at me, the horror of my encounter had faded somewhat, replaced by a burning curiosity. What exactly had I seen out there? Was it still roaming the deeper parts of the wilderness? The questions consumed me, driving me to spend my off hours poring over local folklore and cryptozoology websites. I learned about the long history of dogman sightings in the area, dating back to indigenous legends. I read accounts from trappers and homesteaders that echoed my own experience with chilling similarity, and I began to wonder how many other encounters had been brushed aside, dismissed as stress or imagination. One evening in late September, as I was finishing up a routine patrol of the campground, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Two hikers, looking shaken, were describing to a skeptical campground host how they'd heard strange howls the night before, deep in the backcountry. They spoke of feeling watched, of glimpsing a large, upright shape moving through the trees in the pre-dawn light. I approached them, my heart pounding. As calmly as I could, I asked them to describe exactly where they'd been. They pointed to a spot on the map, a remote area not far from my old cabin. It took every ounce of self-control not to react visibly. Instead, I thanked them for the report, assured them I'd look into it, and advised them to stick to the more populated trails for the rest of their trip. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the hiker's story in my mind, comparing it to my own experience. The rational part of me said to report it up the chain, to let more experienced rangers investigate. But a deeper, more primal part knew that this was my mystery to solve. As dawn broke, I made a decision that would change everything. I packed my backpack with supplies for several days, left a vague note about checking on some remote trail markers, and set off into the wilderness. I was going back to where it all began, determined to find answers or proof, or both. The hike back to my old territory was grueling. I pushed myself hard, driven by a mixture of determination and fear. Every step took me further from the safety of the populated areas, deeper into the domain of whatever creature I'd encountered months ago. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed different now, more menacing. Shadows seemed to move at the corners of my vision, and more than once I whirled around, certain I'd heard footsteps behind me, only to find nothing there. I reached my old cabin as dusk was falling. It stood silent and empty, a dark silhouette against the deepening sky. For a moment I hesitated on the threshold, the memory of that terrifying night flooding back. But I steeled myself and pushed inside, determined not to let fear rule me. The interior was just as I'd left it, a thin layer of dust covering everything. I swept my flashlight beam around, half expecting to see claw marks on the walls, or some other sign of the creature's presence. But there was nothing, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had ever happened here. I set up camp, forcing myself to go through the motions of normalcy. I ate a cold dinner, unable to shake the feeling that lighting a fire would be like sending up a beacon to whatever might be out there in the darkness. As night fell, I sat in the cabin's single chair, rifle across my lap, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. For hours there was nothing but the normal noises of the forest at night. Then, just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined it all, I heard it, that low, mournful howl, distant but unmistakable. My heart began to race, and I gripped my rifle tighter, eyes darting to every shadow. The howl came again, closer this time, and then I heard something else, heavy footsteps, moving with purpose through the underbrush. They were coming straight for the cabin. I had a choice to make. I could barricade myself inside, hide and hope whatever was out there would lose interest. Or I could face it, confront the thing that had been haunting my nightmares for months. In that moment, fear and curiosity warred within me. But in the end, the need to know, to understand, won out. With shaking hands, I unbarred the door and stepped out into the moonlit clearing. At first, I saw nothing. The forest was still, silent in a way that felt oppressive, expectant. Then, at the edge of the tree line, I saw movement. A massive shape detached itself from the shadows, stepping into the pale moonlight. It was just as I remembered, perhaps even larger. 7 feet tall at least, covered in shaggy dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and something almost human, with a long, powerful muzzle filled with teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. And those eyes, intelligent, aware, boring into me with an intensity that froze me in place. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I raised my rifle, more out of instinct than any real belief it would protect me. The creature tilted its head almost curiously. Then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The voice was deep, guttural, clearly not meant for human speech. But the words were unmistakable. "You came back." I nearly dropped my rifle in shock. This was so far beyond anything I had imagined, any explanation I had considered. What are you?" I managed to stammer. The creature took a step closer, and it took every ounce of willpower I had not to turn and run. "We have many names," it growled. "Your kind has called us dogmen, skinwalkers, werewolves. We are older than your cities, your civilization." My mind reeled, struggling to process what I was hearing. This couldn't be real. And yet, here it was, standing before me, speaking. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The creature's eyes narrowed. "This is our land. We were here long before your rangers and campers. We stay hidden, but sometimes one of you sees us, like you did." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Are you going to kill me?" A sound came from the creature that might have been a laugh, but it held no humor. "If we wanted you dead, you would never have left these mountains alive the first time." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a new wave of fear. If it wasn't here to kill me, what did it want? As if reading my thoughts, the creature continued. "You came seeking answers, but ask yourself this, little ranger. Are you prepared for what those answers might mean, for how they might change the world you think you know?" I stood there, my mind racing. This was it, the moment that would define everything. Did I really want to know the truth? Could I handle it? But I knew deep down that I had already made my choice the moment I decided to come back to these mountains. "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I want to know." The creature nodded, a gesture so human it was almost more unsettling than its monstrous appearance. "Then come," it said, turning back towards the dark forest. "There is much to show you." As I followed the creature into the shadows, leaving behind the last vestiges of the world I thought I knew, one thought echoed in my mind. Nothing would ever be the same again. I've struggled with how to end this account, how to explain what I learned in the days that followed. The truth is, much of it defies explanation, at least in terms that would make sense to anyone who hasn't experienced it firsthand. What I can say is this: there are layers to our world, depths of history and biology that our science has barely begun to scratch the surface of. The creature, and others like it, represent a branch of evolution so divergent from our own that encountering them is like meeting beings from another world. They've lived alongside us for millennia, retreating further into the wild places as our civilization has expanded. They possess intelligence easily rivaling our own, and abilities that seem almost supernatural to our limited understanding. I spent 3 days with them, learning more than I ever thought possible about the hidden corners of our world. When I finally returned to Ranger headquarters, I was a changed man. How could I go back to worrying about trail maintenance and campfire safety when I now knew what really lurked in the deep woods? I submitted my resignation shortly after. Hank and the others assumed I'd had some kind of breakdown, that the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. I let them think that. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. These days I live on the outskirts of a small town in Idaho. close enough to civilization to blend in, but near enough to the wilderness to continue my education. I've become something of an intermediary, helping to maintain the delicate balance between our world and theirs. Sometimes on quiet nights I hear a familiar howl in the distance. It no longer fills me with fear. Instead, it's a reminder of the vast, beautiful, terrifying complexity of the world we inhabit. To those who might read this and dismiss it as fiction or the ravings of a madman, I say this. Next time you're in the wild places, in those deep woods where the shadows seem to move of their own accord, pay attention. Listen closely to the sounds of the forest, and if you feel eyes upon you, watching from just beyond the firelight, well, now you know. You're not alone out there. You never were. My name is Kellen, and this is a story I've been hesitant to share. It's been a few years since it happened, but the memories still haunt me, vivid and terrifying. I was working as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park, fresh out of college with a degree in conservation studies. At 23, I was eager to put my knowledge to work in one of America's most beautiful landscapes. Yellowstone is a place of breathtaking beauty, but it's also vast and wild. Most visitors don't realize just how remote and untamed some areas of the park truly are. My job was everything I'd hoped for. I had a cozy cabin to myself, spent my days hiking through pristine wilderness, observing wildlife, and helping tourists appreciate the natural wonders around them. But there was always an undercurrent of respect for the raw power of nature. We were guests here, in a place that could turn dangerous in an instant. It was late September, and the park was transitioning into fall. The crowds had thinned out, leaving behind a sense of tranquility that I cherished. The aspens were beginning to turn golden, and there was a crisp chill in the air that hinted at the winter to come. That particular afternoon I was finishing up some paperwork in my cabin when the call came in. It was about 4:30 p.m., and the sun was already starting to dip low on the horizon. The voice on the radio was Tim, one of the senior rangers. "Kellen, you there? We've got a situation." I grabbed the radio. "Go ahead, Tim, what's up?" "We've got a report of a missing hiker up near Slough Creek. Last seen heading up the trail about 6 hours ago. Solo hiker, male, mid-30s. Name's Greg Harmon." I felt a twinge of concern. Slough Creek was in the northeast part of the park, known for its excellent fly fishing but also for its rugged terrain. It wasn't an area to be taken lightly, especially for a solo hiker. "Any other details?" I asked. "Not much. He was supposed to check in with his wife by satellite phone a couple of hours ago. When he didn't, she called us. We're a bit short-staffed today with that training seminar in Bozeman. Think you can head up there and start a preliminary search?" I glanced at my watch. It would be getting dark in a couple of hours, but I knew the area well. "Yeah, I can do that. I'll grab my gear and head out right away." "Good man," Tim replied. "Keep in radio contact. If you don't find anything before dark, we'll organize a full search party for first light tomorrow." I acknowledged and signed off, then quickly began gathering my equipment. Into my backpack went a first aid kit, extra water, high-energy snacks, a thermal blanket, and additional layers of clothing. I clipped my radio and flashlight to my belt, made sure my service weapon was secure in its holster, and grabbed my heavy-duty hiking boots. As I stepped outside, I took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the landscape, and in the distance I could hear the haunting bugle of an elk. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a peaceful evening. But as I climbed into my truck and started the engine, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The drive to the Slough Creek trailhead took about 45 minutes. As I drove, I mentally reviewed wilderness survival protocols and possible scenarios. A twisted ankle, perhaps? Or maybe the hiker had simply lost track of time and would be emerging from the trail at any moment, apologetic and a bit embarrassed. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered other possibilities. Mountain lions had been spotted in the area recently, and while rare, there was always the possibility of a bear attack. I pushed these thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was dipping below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. In different circumstances, I would have paused to appreciate the beauty. Instead, I quickly donned my backpack, checked my gear one last time, and set off up the trail. The Slough Creek Trail starts off easily enough, winding through lodgepole pine forests and open meadows, but I knew that further in it becomes more challenging, with steep inclines and rocky terrain. As I hiked, I called out periodically, "Hello? Greg Harmon? Yellowstone Park Service, can you hear me?" My voice echoed through the trees, met only by the occasional rustle of leaves or call of a bird settling in for the night. The light was fading quickly now, long shadows stretching across the path. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing gloom. About 2 miles in, the main trail began to narrow. The going got tougher, roots and rocks creating treacherous footing in the dim light. I've hiked these woods countless times, but there's something about the shifting shadows at dusk that can play tricks on your mind. More than once, I could have sworn I saw something large moving just at the edge of my vision. Each time I turned to look, there was nothing there but the silent, looming trees. It was nearing full dark when I came across the first sign of Greg Harmon. In a small clearing just off the main trail, I found the remnants of a campsite. My heart sank as I took in the scene before me. The tent was in tatters, shredded fabric fluttering in the gentle evening breeze. Camping gear lay scattered about, a sleeping bag here, a cooking pot there. Food wrappers were strewn across the forest floor. But it was the dark stains on the ground that made my blood run cold. Even in the dim light of my flashlight, there was no mistaking it for anything but blood. A lot of it. I swallowed hard, forcing down the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Kellen. I found something. Over." The reply came back, crackling with static. "Go ahead, Kellen. What's your status? Over." "I've located what appears to be the missing hiker's campsite. It's been destroyed. There's blood, a lot of it. No sign of Greg Harmon. This looks like an animal attack, possibly bear. Requesting immediate backup and search party. Over." There was a pause before the response came. "Copy that, Kellen. Stay alert. Help is on the way. Maintain your position and don't take any unnecessary risks. Over." "Understood. I'll secure the perimeter and wait for backup. Over and out." I clipped the radio back to my belt, my hand lingering near my sidearm. The forest suddenly felt much darker, much more threatening. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. Forcing myself to focus, I knelt to examine the scene more closely. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, as if something large was trying to catch its breath after a long chase. At first I hoped, it might be Greg Harmon. Maybe he was injured, hiding nearby. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence of the forest. "Mr. Harmon, are you there?" No response came, but the breathing continued. It sounded wrong, not human. A prickle of fear ran down my spine as I slowly turned, scanning the dense trees surrounding the clearing. For a moment I saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. Without hesitation, I swung my flashlight towards it, the powerful beam cutting through the darkness. What I saw in that moment will haunt me for the rest of my days. Standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight was something that defied easy categorization or explanation. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet and possibly more. But it wasn't just the height that was unsettling. It was the way it stood, the way it moved. Its shoulders were massive, far broader than any human's, with long arms that seemed slightly out of proportion to its body. It was hunched over slightly, as if ready to spring into action at any moment. But it was the head that truly chilled me to my core. The creature's face was elongated, almost like a snout, with teeth that reflected the light of my flashlight. They were long, sharp, and numerous, a predator's teeth designed for tearing flesh. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow in the beam of my light, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly inhuman. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that spoke of long years spent hunting in the darkest corners of the wilderness. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, frozen by a primal fear that overrode all rational thought. Then, with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large, the creature vanished back into the darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. With trembling hands I fumbled for my radio, my eyes darting frantically around the clearing, expecting the creature to lunge at me at any moment. "Base!" I gasped into the radio, my voice high and panicked. "Base, come in! There's something out here, not a bear. I don't know what it is, but it's big, it's fast, and it's dangerous. I need immediate evac." My frantic report was cut short by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a roar, but not like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not any animal I could identify. It was a primal, bone-chilling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very trees around me. It spoke of hunger, of rage, of a predatory instinct honed over countless generations. The radio crackled to life, but I could barely make out the words over the pounding of my own heart. "Repeat. Ranger. Over." But I was beyond coherent communication at that point. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, and fast. Whatever this creature was, it had already destroyed the campsite, possibly killed or gravely injured Greg Harmon. And now it seemed to have turned its attention to me. I ran. There was no plan, no carefully considered escape route. Just blind animal panic driving me to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots and stones threatening to trip me with every step. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly, creating a disorienting strobe effect that only added to my terror. Behind me I could hear it, the heavy thud of its feet on the forest floor, the crack of breaking branches as it pursued me. It was fast, far faster than something of its size should have been. With every labored breath I expected to feel its claws raking across my back, its teeth sinking into my neck. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chase stopped. The woods fell silent once more, save for my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I kept running, driven by a fear so deep it bypassed all rational thought. It wasn't until I stumbled onto a familiar trail that I finally slowed. Relief flooded through me as I recognized where I was. This path led back to the main road, to safety, to other people. Bent over, hands on my knees, I gulped in great lungfuls of air, trying to calm my racing heart. As the immediate panic began to subside, questions started to crowd my mind. What was that thing? Why had it stopped chasing me? Was Greg Harmon still alive somewhere in these woods? And perhaps most chillingly, was I really safe? Or was this just another part of its hunt? I knew I needed to report what I'd seen, to organize a search party, to do something. But in that moment, all I wanted was to get back to my truck and get as far away from this place as possible. The trek back to the parking area seemed to take an eternity. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. By the time I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw my truck sitting there in the twilight, I was nearly in tears from relief. I all but ran to the vehicle, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly it took several attempts to get the key into the lock. As I finally wrenched the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the light cast by my headlights was the creature. In the dim illumination I could see it more clearly than before, and the sight made my breath catch in my throat. It was even taller than I'd first thought, its body covered in matted dark fur. Its arms hung low, ending in hands tipped with long curved claws that looked capable of rending flesh from bone with terrifying ease. But it was the face that truly held me transfixed. The elongated snout was filled with teeth that would put a grizzly bear to shame. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me. They burned with an intelligence that was undeniably predatory, but also curious, as if it was studying me, learning about its prey. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was frozen in place, one hand still on the key in the ignition, the other reaching futilely for the service weapon under my seat. The creature began to pace, slowly circling my truck. Occasionally it would press itself against the windows, its hot breath fogging the glass. I could hear its claws scraping against the metal of the truck, a sound that set my teeth on edge. All the while its eyes never left mine, It felt like a sick game, watching me trapped and terrified, perhaps savoring my fear. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I was on the verge of either starting the engine and trying to run it down or breaking down completely, the creature stopped. It stood there for a moment longer, those burning eyes locked on mine. Then, with one last soul-piercing glance, it turned and loped back into the trees, disappearing into the gathering darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. With shaking hands, I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I threw the truck into gear and tore down the road, gravel spraying behind me. As I drove, I fumbled for the radio, calling in a frantic, barely coherent report. The response I got was, well, let's just say my story didn't exactly go over well. Words like stress and exhaustion were thrown around. There were subtle suggestions that maybe I had let my imagination run wild in the dark, transforming a bear or mountain lion into something more fantastical. When the backup finally arrived, a full search team scoured the area. They found no sign of the creature I'd described. No shredded tent, no blood-stained campsite. Even Greg Harmon turned up, having simply gotten turned around and spent an unplanned night in the backcountry. He was apologetic, a bit embarrassed, but unharmed. Officially, the case was left open. Unofficially, I think everyone chalked it up to an overactive imagination and poor lighting conditions. Maybe a bear sighting blown out of proportion by fear and exhaustion. I tried to convince myself of this too. I went over the events in my mind countless times, trying to find a rational explanation. But deep down, I know what I saw. Every time I close my eyes, I see that elongated snout pressed against my truck window, those glowing eyes watching me with that unsettling intelligence. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at shadows. I started carrying my sidearm even when off duty, much to the bemusement of my colleagues. At night, lying in bed, I'd sometimes think I heard that raspy breathing outside my window. It wasn't long before I left the Park Service. I told myself and others that it was time for a change, that I wanted to put my degree to use in other ways. But the truth is, I couldn't bear to be in those woods anymore, not knowing what might be out there, watching and waiting. Sometimes in my darker moments I consider going back, trying to find proof, to vindicate myself and my story. But a wiser part of me, the part that still wants to be able to sleep at night, tells me to leave it alone, because some mysteries, some secrets of the wild places of the world, maybe they're better left undisturbed. But life has a way of circling back, of dragging us into the very things we try to avoid. It's been 5 years since that night in Yellowstone. 5 years of trying to forget, of building a new life far from the wilderness that once called to me. I left the Park Service, moved to a bustling city, and took a job with an environmental consulting firm. The steady rhythm of urban life, the constant noise and movement, it helped keep the memories at bay, most of the time. But there were still nights when I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that bone-chilling roar ringing in my ears. Moments when a shadow in a dark alley would make my heart race, my hand instinctively reaching for a weapon I no longer carried. The creature haunted the edges of my mind, a persistent reminder of a world beyond our understanding. I might have gone on like that indefinitely, living a life half in shadow, always looking over my shoulder. But then, the email came. It was from Tim, my old supervisor at Yellowstone. We'd kept in loose contact over the years, exchanging the occasional message or holiday greeting. But this was different, urgent. "Kellen," it read, "I know you left this all behind, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. But there's been another incident, like yours. We need your help." Attached was a news article. 3 hikers missing in Yellowstone, last seen near Slough Creek. My hands shook as I read the details. Shredded campsite, large amounts of blood, no bodies found. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. The creature's eyes burning with that eerie intelligence, the sound of its claws on metal, the primal fear that had driven me from the woods I once loved. I should have deleted the email, should have blocked Tim's number, booked a flight to somewhere far away. Instead, I found myself packing a bag, checking the departure times for flights to Wyoming. 2 days later, I was driving down a familiar road, the grand expanse of Yellowstone stretching out before me. The beauty of the place hit me anew, the sweeping vistas, the pristine wilderness. But now there was an undercurrent of menace to it all. What secrets did these woods hold? Tim met me at the ranger station, his face grave. "Thanks for coming, Kellen. I know this can't be easy for you." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The familiar surroundings were bringing back memories I'd tried hard to suppress. "We've kept this quiet," Tim continued, leading me to a small conference room. "Official story is still just missing hikers. But after what you reported 5 years ago, well, let's just say some of us have been keeping an open mind." He spread out a map on the table, pointing to a section marked in red. "The hikers were last seen here. It's not far from where you had your encounter." I leaned in, studying the terrain. It was rugged country, full of deep ravines and dense forest, perfect territory for something to hide, something that didn't want to be found. "What's the plan?" I asked, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. Tim sighed. "Officially, we're organizing a search party, but unofficially, we want you to go in first. Alone." I stared at him, a chill running down my spine. "You can't be serious." "You're the only one who's seen this thing and lived to tell about it," Tim said. "If it's out there, you have the best chance of finding it, or at least finding evidence of it." Part of me wanted to refuse, to walk out and never look back, but another part, a part I thought I'd left behind years ago, was intrigued, excited even. The mystery that had haunted me for 5 years was calling, and this time I was going in prepared. We spent the next day going over equipment: high-powered rifles, tranquilizer guns, night vision goggles, cameras with motion sensors that we could set up throughout the search area. Tim had even managed to get his hands on some experimental tech, a thermal imaging drone that could survey wide areas quickly and quietly. As the sun set on my second day back in Yellowstone, I found myself once again at the Slough Creek trailhead, but this time I wasn't a naive young ranger stumbling into the unknown. I was a man with a mission, armed with both knowledge and firepower. The hike into the backcountry was tense, every sense on high alert. The weight of the rifle on my back was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder of why I was here, of what I might face. I set up camp near the site of the hikers' disappearance, carefully placing cameras and motion sensors in a wide perimeter. The thermal imaging drone hummed softly as I sent it up for its first sweep of the area. As night fell, I settled in to wait, night vision goggles at the ready. Hours passed. The forest was alive with small sounds, the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a night bird. But nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of the creature that had haunted my nightmares for 5 years. It was nearing dawn when one of the motion sensors pinged. I was instantly alert, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line. For a long moment there was nothing. Then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding night, moving with fluid grace through the trees. It was just as I remembered, impossibly tall, powerfully built, moving with a speed that belied its size. My heart pounded as I raised the rifle, the creature centered in my scope. This was the moment I'd both dreaded and longed for. The chance to prove I wasn't crazy, to confront the thing that had upended my life. But as my finger tensed on the trigger, the creature turned. Those eyes, glowing with otherworldly intelligence, met mine. And in that moment I understood. This wasn't some monster, some mindless beast. This was a creature of the deep wilderness, a living embodiment of nature's mysteries. Shooting it would be like trying to capture the wind, to hold back the tide. Slowly I lowered the rifle. The creature watched me, its gaze unblinking. Then, with a grace that took my breath away, it melted back into the forest. I sat there as the sun rose, casting golden light across the wilderness. The cameras had captured images, the sensors had recorded data. I had my proof. But I also had a choice to make. In the end, I went back to Tim with a story of equipment malfunctions and inconclusive evidence. The search for the missing hikers continued, but quietly. The case of the Yellowstone creature was closed. I left Yellowstone again, but this time not in fear. Instead, I carried with me a profound respect for the mysteries of the natural world, and the humility to know that some things are beyond our understanding. The creature is still out there, I'm sure of it, roaming the deep woods, a living secret of the wilderness. And in a way I'm glad. In a world where we've mapped every inch of the globe, where technology has stripped away so much wonder, It's comforting to know that there are still mysteries out there, still things that defy explanation. Sometimes on quiet nights I find myself looking out towards the distant mountains, and I smile, knowing that in those vast wild spaces something extraordinary roams free. A reminder that the world is bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than we can ever truly know. It's been years since the incident, and I still find myself hesitating before sharing this story. The memories are vivid, etched into my mind like claw marks on bark. But I feel compelled to recount what happened, if only to make sense of it all. Perhaps by putting it down in words, I can finally exorcise the demons that have haunted me since that fateful summer in Glacier National Park. My name is Ben, and back then I was in my mid-20s, working as a park ranger in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Glacier National Park in Montana is a vast wilderness of rugged mountains, pristine forests, and crystal-clear lakes. It's the kind of place that makes you feel small, insignificant in the face of nature's grandeur. Little did I know how that feeling would take on a whole new meaning. I loved my job, the solitude, the crisp mountain air, the satisfaction of maintaining the trails for visitors to enjoy safely. It all suited me perfectly. I was fit, confident, and perhaps a little too comfortable with the idea that I could handle whatever the wilderness threw at me. Bears, part of the job, mountain lions, keep your distance and you'll be fine. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that summer. It was early June, and the park was just starting to come alive after a long, harsh winter. The snow was melting, revealing vibrant wildflowers and fresh green growth. Tourists were beginning to trickle in, eager to explore the park's wonders. As always, it was our job to ensure the trails were safe and accessible. That particular day, I was assigned to check out the South Loop Trail. It's one of the less traveled paths in the park, winding through dense forest and offering breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks. There had been reports of a downed tree a few miles in, blocking the trail. Armed with my trusty chainsaw, I set out early in the morning, ready to clear the obstruction. The day started like any other. The sun was just peeking over the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. Birds were singing their morning songs, and a light mist hung in the air, giving everything an almost ethereal quality. I breathed deeply, savoring the crisp, pine-scented air as I made my way along the trail. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across the downed tree. It was a massive old-growth pine, probably toppled by a recent storm. I set down my pack, pulled out the chainsaw, and got to work. The steady buzz of the saw filled the air, drowning out the natural sounds of the forest. That's when I first felt it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The birds had gone quiet. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I paused, lifting my finger off the chainsaw's trigger, and that's when I heard it. A rustling sound off to my right, deeper in the woods. My first thought was a bear, of course. We had protocols for bear encounters, and I dealt with them before. But this was different. The movement was too light, too deliberate for a lumbering bear. I froze, my hand instinctively tightening on the chainsaw's handle. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, a primal response to an unseen threat. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. There it was again, a soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Whatever it was moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with where I stood. My heart began to race. I lifted the chainsaw, its weight oddly comforting in my hands. The low hum of the idling motor seemed to fill the eerie silence of the forest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive quiet. "Park ranger, is someone there?" No response, just another rustle, closer this time. Swallowing hard, I took a cautious step forward, peering into the dense undergrowth. The foliage was thick, shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it. A flash of movement. A dark shape larger than any animal I'd encountered in these woods. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, bipedal but hunched, covered in what looked like thick matted fur. For a split second I wondered if it was some idiot in a costume trying to pull a Bigfoot prank. But no human could move like that, with such predatory grace. The thing paused, and I swear I could feel its gaze upon me. Through the leaves and branches, I caught a glimpse of its face, if you could call it that. Beneath the fur was a snout, not quite wolf-like, not quite bear-like, but something horrifyingly in between. And its eyes. God, its eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow, filled with an intelligence that sent ice through my veins. Fight or flight kicked in, and flight won out. I turned and ran, abandoning the chainsaw and my pack. Branches whipped at my face as I tore down the trail, my boots pounding against the earth. I didn't dare look back, convinced that if I did, I'd see that thing right on my heels. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Only when I reached a small clearing did I finally slow down, gasping for air. The forest around me was silent, save for the thunder of my own heartbeat in my ears. I spun in a circle, searching for any sign of pursuit, but saw nothing. Shaken and disoriented, I made my way back to the ranger station. My colleague Ryan was at the desk when I stumbled in. One look at my face and he knew something was wrong. "Jesus, Ben," he said, rising from his chair. "What happened to you?" I must have looked a mess, scratched up from my mad dash through the woods, pale and wild-eyed. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? There's a downed tree on the south loop," I managed to stammer out. "Couldn't clear it. Left the chainsaw." Ryan furrowed his brow, clearly not buying my weak explanation. "That's it. You look like you've seen a ghost, man." I forced a laugh, trying to play it cool. "Nah, just thought I saw a bear. Spooked me a bit. I'm fine." Ryan didn't seem convinced, but he let it go. "All right, well, I'll head out there later to take care of that tree. Why don't you take a breather?" I nodded gratefully and slipped into the back room, snagging a bottle of water. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely twist off the cap. As the cool liquid hit my parched throat, I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. It couldn't be real, could it? Maybe the isolation was getting to me, playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was all too real. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing yellow orbs staring back at me. I jumped at every sound, convinced that the creature was out there, watching, waiting. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but I brushed off their concerns with weak excuses about not feeling well. It was on the fourth night after the encounter that things took an even darker turn. I was lying in my bunk at the ranger cabin, tossing and turning, when a sound outside jolted me fully awake. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood. Something was out there, circling the cabin. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands, debating whether to wake the others. But a selfish part of me was afraid they wouldn't believe me, afraid of being labeled the crazy ranger who saw monsters in the woods. The scratching continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I could hear heavy breathing, snuffling sounds like some massive predator trying to catch a scent. My own breath came in short, panicked gasps as I sat paralyzed in my bunk. Then silence. The oppressive quiet stretched on for what felt like hours. Just as I began to think I'd imagined it all, a shadow fell across the window near my bunk. A massive, misshapen silhouette blocked out the moonlight. I could make out the vague outline of an elongated snout, pointed ears, and those eyes, those terrible glowing eyes peering in at me. I must have made a sound, a whimper of terror, because the thing's head snapped towards me. Our gazes locked, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that this was no ordinary animal. There was an intelligence behind those eyes, a malevolent awareness that chilled me to my core. As quickly as it appeared, the shadow vanished. I heard the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, moving away from the cabin at incredible speed. I sat there, shaking and sweating, until the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The next morning I examined the exterior of the cabin. Long, deep claw marks scored the wooden walls, too big to be from any bear or mountain lion. My colleagues were baffled, speculating about some unusually aggressive grizzly. But I knew the truth, even if I couldn't bring myself to speak it aloud. That day I made a decision. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed to confide in someone, to get another perspective on what was happening. That's when I turned to Kyle, a fellow ranger with a penchant for the strange and unexplained. Kyle had always been the guy telling campfire stories about Bigfoot sightings and alien abductions. I'd rolled my eyes at his tales in the past, but now I was desperate for any explanation, no matter how outlandish. I caught up with Kyle during our lunch break, pulling him aside to a quiet corner of the mess hall. "Hey man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to talk to you about something weird." Kyle's eyes lit up with interest. "Weird how?" I took a deep breath and launched into my story, describing the encounter on the trail and the terrifying night at the cabin. As I spoke, Kyle's expression shifted from excitement to genuine concern. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Holy shit, Ben, that's intense. And you're sure it wasn't just a bear?" I shook my head vehemently. "No way. This thing was walking on 2 legs, Kyle, and its face, God, its face, it was like nothing I've ever seen." Kyle leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know what this sounds like, right? There have been reports of something similar in other parks. They call it Dogman." "Dogman?" I repeated skeptically. Kyle nodded eagerly. "Yeah, like a werewolf, but more. Some cryptozoologists think it might be a remnant population of prehistoric dire wolves that evolved to walk upright. Others say it's some kind of interdimensional being." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it all as nonsense. But after what I'd seen, could I really rule anything out? "So what do I do?" I asked, feeling lost. "You gotta report this, man," Kyle insisted. "There are organizations that investigate this kind of thing. They could help." I scoffed. "Yeah, and get laughed out of my job? No thanks." But Kyle was insistent. He went on about other reported sightings in the region, vague stories on the internet about disappearances and mutilated livestock. None of it seemed solid, yet doubt started to worm its way into my mind. It wasn't impossible, just very, very unlikely. As the days wore on, I found myself diving deeper into Kyle's world of cryptozoology and fringe theories. I scoured online forums, reading accounts from people who claimed to have encountered similar creatures. Some of the stories were clearly hoaxes or the product of overactive imaginations, but others rang true in a way that made my blood run cold. I learned about the long history of Dogman sightings, stretching back to Native American legends of shapeshifters and skinwalkers. There were reports from all over North America, often in remote wilderness areas like our own. The descriptions varied, but certain elements remained consistent: the massive size, the bipedal gait, the glowing eyes, and an intelligence that seemed far beyond that of any known animal. The more I read, the more conflicted I became. Part of me desperately wanted to believe that what I'd seen was just a bear, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational, ordered world. As my obsession grew, my work began to suffer. I was distracted, jumpy, always looking over my shoulder. My fellow rangers noticed, of course. They attributed it to stress, maybe the beginnings of burnout. If only they knew the real reason for my deteriorating mental state. It was about 2 weeks after my initial encounter that things came to a head. I was scheduled for an early morning patrol of the same area where I'd first seen the creature. Part of me wanted to call in sick to avoid that stretch of forest entirely, but a larger part, the part driven by a need for answers, compelled me to go. The morning dawned gray and misty, a light drizzle falling from low-hanging clouds. As I set out on the trail, an oppressive silence seemed to blanket the woods. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. My hand rested on the butt of my sidearm, a standard-issue pistol that suddenly felt woefully inadequate. Each snap of a twig under my boot sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. About an hour into my patrol, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "This is Park Ranger Ben. Identify yourself." The only response was another growl, closer this time. And then I saw it, emerging from the mist like something out of a nightmare. The creature stood easily 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in dark, matted fur. Its head was a horrifying blend of wolf and bear, with an elongated snout filled with dagger-like teeth. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed, glowing yellow orbs that radiated an otherworldly intelligence. In that moment, I knew I was face to face with something ancient, something that had stalked these woods long before humans ever set foot here. My training kicked in, and I drew my sidearm with trembling hands. "Stay back," I shouted, trying to inject authority into my voice. "I'm warning you." The creature tilted its head almost curiously, and then it charged. I fired wildly, the sound of gunshots echoing through the trees. But if any of my bullets found their mark, the beast gave no indication. It slammed into me with the force of a freight train, sending us both tumbling to the forest floor. Pain exploded in my shoulder as its claws sunk deep. I screamed, struggling against its immense weight. The stench of wet fur and rotting meat filled my nostrils, as its face loomed over mine, jaws opening wide to reveal rows of yellowed fangs. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die, torn apart by a monster in the middle of nowhere. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final killing blow. But it never came. Instead, I heard a shout and the crack of a rifle. The creature's grip on me loosened, and I seized the opportunity to scramble away. Through the haze of pain and terror, I saw Marcus, one of my fellow rangers, his rifle raised and smoking. "Run!" Marcus yelled, firing again as the beast turned its attention to this new threat. I didn't need to be told twice. Ignoring the searing pain in my shoulder, I staggered to my feet and ran. Marcus was right behind me, both of us crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. I could hear the creature pursuing, its heavy footfalls and enraged roars spurring us to even greater speed. How long we ran, I couldn't say. Time seemed to blur, each second stretching into an eternity as we fled for our lives. The sound of pursuit gradually faded, but we didn't slow our pace until we finally burst out of the tree line near the ranger station. We stumbled inside, both of us a mess. I was bleeding profusely from the gashes in my shoulder, and Marcus looked pale as a ghost. The other rangers on duty rushed to our aid, their faces a mix of shock and concern. "What the hell happened out there?" demanded our supervisor Tom as he helped me into a chair. Marcus and I exchanged a look. How could we possibly explain what we'd just experienced? In that moment, I saw the same fear and disbelief in Marcus's eyes that I'd been grappling with for weeks. "Animal attack," Marcus said finally, his voice hoarse. "Big bear, maybe. Got the drop on Ben. I heard him yell and came running." It was a lie, and we both knew it. But what else could we say? That we'd been chased through the woods by some impossible creature straight out of a horror movie? We'd be laughed out of our jobs, maybe even committed. As the other rangers tended to my wounds and called for medical evacuation, Marcus pulled me aside. "Ben," he whispered urgently, "what the fuck was that thing?" I shook my head, wincing at the pain. "I don't know, man. I've been seeing it for weeks. I thought I was going crazy." Marcus's eyes widened. "Weeks? Why didn't you say anything?" "Would you have believed me?" I asked bitterly. He had no answer for that. The official report we filed was vague. An encounter with an unusually aggressive bear. We described it as best we could without sounding insane, emphasizing its size and ferocity. But we both knew no bear moved the way that thing did. No bear had those terrifying, intelligent eyes. In the days that followed, search parties combed the area where the attack occurred. They found signs of a struggle, blood, mine on the ground, and massive, unidentifiable tracks that quickly disappeared into the denser parts of the forest. The incident was chalked up to a freak encounter with a particularly large and bold predator, possibly a grizzly bear. But I knew the truth, and so did Marcus. Late at night, when the others were asleep, we'd talk in hushed voices about what we'd seen. Marcus admitted that he'd been hearing strange noises in the woods for months, sounds that didn't match any known animal. He'd dismissed them, rationalized them away. But now he couldn't deny the reality of what we'd encountered. As my wounds healed, my resolve strengthened. I couldn't stay in Glacier National Park, not with that thing out there. The constant fear, the feeling of being watched whenever I stepped into the woods, it was too much to bear. With a heavy heart, I tendered my resignation. Marcus understood. He decided to stay on, driven by a need to protect others from the threat we now knew existed. We made a pact to keep in touch, to share any information we might uncover about the creature. Before I left, we had one last tense conversation with Kyle. We told him everything, and to his credit, he believed us without question. He urged us to go public with our story, to contact cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators. But we refused. The truth was too dangerous, too unbelievable. We'd be discredited, our lives ruined, and who knew what that kind of attention might bring? If there was one of these creatures out there, could there be more? So we decided to keep our silence, carrying the burden of this terrible knowledge alone. It's been 5 years since I left Glacier National Park. I've tried to move on, to build a new life far from the wilderness that once called to me. But the memories of that summer haunt me still. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake in a cold sweat, convinced I hear the scrape of claws outside my window. In my darkest moments, I wonder if the creature followed me, if it's out there somewhere watching and waiting. Marcus and I still talk regularly. He's stayed vigilant, keeping an eye out for any signs of the creature's return. So far, there have been no more direct encounters, but he tells me of strange tracks found deep in the backcountry, of hikers reporting eerie howls that don't quite sound like wolves. I've done my own research, discreetly reaching out to others who claim to have had similar encounters. The stories are scattered across North America, each one chilling in its similarity to our own experience. Whatever this thing is, Dogman, Skinwalker, or something else entirely, it's clear that it's not isolated to Glacier National Park. There are nights when I consider going public with our story. Damn the consequences. But then I remember those glowing eyes, that terrifying intelligence, and I hesitate. What if sharing this knowledge only puts more people in danger? What if it provokes these creatures to become more aggressive, more visible? So I keep my silence, and I warn you now, be careful in the deep woods. If you hear something moving in the shadows, something that doesn't sound quite right, don't dismiss it. And if you catch a glimpse of glowing eyes watching you from the darkness, run, and don't look back. Because now you know what I know. There are things out there, things that defy explanation. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. The wilderness will never look the same again. As for me, I've made my peace with the fact that I'll probably never know the full truth about what's out there. But I remain vigilant, always watching the tree line, always listening for that telltale growl. Because deep down I know that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of North America, the watcher in the woods is still out there, waiting, watching, and maybe, just maybe, hunting. It's been years since that night, but the memories still haunt me. I've tried to move on, to forget, but some things just don't let go. I guess it's time I finally put it all down, try to make sense of what happened. Maybe writing it out will help, or maybe it'll just bring it all back. Either way, here goes. I was 22 when it all started, living in a small town in Nevada, about an hour outside of Las Vegas. Sounds glamorous, right? Trust me, it wasn't. Milldale was the kind of place where dreams went to die, where ambition withered under the relentless desert sun. Population, 3,742 souls, most of them counting down the days until they could leave. I was no different. I'd graduated high school with big plans, but life has a way of derailing even the best-laid schemes. So there I was, working the night shift at Ed's Gas and Go, the only 24-hour joint on a lonely stretch of highway cutting through the Mojave. It wasn't much, but it was a paycheck, a way to save up while I figured out my next move. The town didn't offer much in the way of entertainment. On my days off, I'd sometimes hang out with the few friends who hadn't managed to escape yet. We'd drive out to Red Rock Canyon, hike the trails, and pretend we were anywhere else. It was beautiful out there in its own stark way. The red sandstone cliffs, the scrubby desert plants clinging to life, the vast open sky. But even that beauty had an edge to it, a reminder of how small and insignificant we were in the face of nature's indifference. Most nights at the gas station were uneventful. Truckers stopping for coffee, the occasional tourist who'd taken a wrong turn off the interstate, local insomniacs buying cigarettes at 3 a.m. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of it, the quiet hum of the refrigerators, the flicker of the fluorescent lights, the endless stretch of darkness beyond the windows. But that night in late October, everything changed. It was a Tuesday, I remember that clearly. The air had that crisp autumn feel to it, a welcome relief from the scorching summer we'd had. I was working the closing shift, 4 p.m. to midnight. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, I began my usual closing routine, restocking the coolers, wiping down the counters, counting the cash in the register. That's when they rolled in. I heard them before I saw them, the low rumble of motorcycle engines cutting through the quiet evening. 2 bikes pulled into the lot, their riders decked out in leather and denim. They parked near the door, leaving their engines idling as they dismounted. Now we got bikers through here sometimes. Usually they were just passing through, grabbing snacks or using the restroom before hitting the road again. But something about these two set my nerves on edge from the moment they walked in. The first one was tall and lean, with a scraggly beard and eyes that darted around the store, never settling in one place. But it was his companion that really got to me. The guy was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall and built like a linebacker. He had a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left eye down to his chin, twisting his mouth into a permanent sneer. They didn't buy anything, just wandered the aisles, picking things up and putting them back down. I kept my head down, focusing on counting the register, but I could feel the big guy's eyes on me. Every time I glanced up, he was watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Closing time, fellas," I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Gonna have to ask you to wrap it up." The smaller one grunted and headed for the door. The big guy lingered, still staring at me. He reached into his pocket, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought he was going for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a battered pack of cigarettes. "Got a light?" he asked, his voice a low growl. I shook my head. "Sorry, don't smoke." He grunted, shoving the pack back into his pocket. "Shame," he said, and there was something in his tone that sent a shiver down my spine. He turned and walked out, but not before giving me one last look that I can only describe as hungry. I waited until I heard their bikes roar to life and fade into the distance before I let out the breath I'd been holding. My hands were shaking as I finished locking up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The parking lot was dimly lit, the old sodium lamps casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The nearest building was an abandoned diner about a quarter mile down the road. Beyond that, nothing but desert stretching out into the darkness. I hurried to my car, an old Honda Civic that had seen better days. The whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those bikers lurking in the shadows. As I fumbled with my keys, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. There at the edge of the lot were 2 figures, just standing there, watching me. Even in the poor light, I recognized the hulking shape of the bigger biker. Panic surged through me. I managed to get the key in the lock, yanking the door open and practically diving inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, refusing to turn over. Come on," I muttered, glancing up to see one of the figures starting to walk towards me. Finally, mercifully, the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as I peeled out of the lot. I didn't slow down until I was on the highway, the gas station nothing but a speck in my rearview mirror. By the time I got home to my small apartment on the outskirts of town, I was a wreck. I double-checked all the locks, even dragged a chair in front of the door for good measure. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every little sound, convinced that at any moment I'd hear the rumble of motorcycles outside my window. When dawn finally broke, I felt hollow, wrung out. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing everything in its harsh light, I started to feel foolish. Had I overreacted? Maybe those guys were just passing through and my imagination had run wild. I tried to shake it off as I got ready for my shift. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just an ordinary night at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. But deep down, a part of me knew better. Something had changed that night, set in motion a chain of events that would upend my life in ways I couldn't begin to imagine. If only I'd known then what was coming, maybe I could have done something, anything to change it. But that's the thing about horror, isn't it? It creeps up on you, silent and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And strike it did. The day after my encounter with the bikers dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that makes you forget the chill of the night before. I hadn't slept much, my mind replaying the events at the gas station over and over. By the time I dragged myself out of bed, I was exhausted and on edge. I had the day shift, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., and I seriously considered calling in sick. But I needed the money, and a part of me hoped that the routine of work would help settle my nerves. So I dragged myself to my beat-up Civic, checking the back seat before I got in, a new habit I'd picked up overnight. The drive to work was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every car that passed, every person I saw on the street seemed potentially threatening. I knew I was being paranoid, but after last night, I couldn't help it. When I pulled into the gas station lot, I was relieved to see my friend Cassie's car already there. Cassie was a few years older than me, one of the few people in town I actually connected with. She worked part-time at the station while taking online classes, dreaming of the day she could leave Milldale behind. As I walked in, the bell above the door jingling, Cassie looked up from her phone and gave me a concerned look. "Geez, you look like hell," she said by way of greeting. I managed a weak smile. "Thanks. Didn't sleep much." Cassie's brow furrowed. "Everything okay?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to brush it off, pretend everything was fine. But Cassie had always been a good listener, and I needed to talk to someone about what had happened. So I told her, about the bikers, the way they'd acted, the feeling of being watched in the parking lot. As I spoke, I could see the concern growing on Cassie's face. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "That's pretty freaky," she said finally. "Did you call the cops?" I shook my head. "And tell them what? That some guys came into the store and didn't buy anything? That I got spooked in a dark parking lot? They'd laugh me out of town." Cassie nodded, understanding. In a small town like ours, you didn't call the cops unless you had a damn good reason. And as unsettling as my experience had been, it wasn't exactly a crime. "Well, you're safe now," Cassie said, reaching out to squeeze my arm. "And hey, I can give you a ride home after your shift if you want, just in case." I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. "Thanks, Cassie, I might take you up on that." The rest of the morning passed slowly. Every time the bell rang, I'd tense up, half expecting to see those bikers walk in. But it was just the usual crowd, locals grabbing coffee, truckers fueling up, the occasional tourist asking for directions. Around noon, Cassie's shift ended, but she stuck around saying she wanted to grab lunch from the diner down the road. I suspected she was really staying to keep an eye on me, and I appreciated it more than I could say. As we were chatting by the register, a local news report on the small TV in the corner caught my attention. The anchor, a woman with too perfect hair and a practiced, concerned expression, was talking about a missing hiker. Local authorities are asking for the public's help in locating 28-year-old Michael Chen, who was last seen 3 days ago entering the Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area, the anchor said. Chen's car was found in the parking lot, but there's been no sign of him on any of the trails. Cassie shook her head. "That's the third one this year," she said. "You'd think people would learn to be more careful out there." I nodded, but something about the story nagged at me. Red Rock Canyon wasn't exactly the wilderness. It was a popular spot, well-traveled. How did someone just vanish out there? The thought stuck with me for the rest of my shift. As the day wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, I found myself growing more and more anxious. By the time 4 p.m. rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. True to her word, Cassie was waiting for me as I clocked out. "Ready to go?" she asked, dangling her car keys. I nodded gratefully, following her out to the parking lot. As we drove away from the gas station, I felt some of the tension start to ease out of my shoulders. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe those bikers were long gone, just passing through on their way to somewhere else. But as we turned onto my street, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, parked across from my apartment building, were 2 motorcycles. They weren't the same ones from last night. At least I didn't think they were, but the sight of them was enough to send my heart racing. "Cassie," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "can I stay at your place tonight?" She followed my gaze, her eyes widening as she saw the bikes. Without a word, she nodded and kept driving, leaving my apartment and those ominous motorcycles behind us. As we headed to Cassie's place on the other side of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in Milldale. The missing hiker, the bikers, the constant sense of being watched. It all added up to something, but I couldn't quite grasp what. All I knew was that the quiet little town I'd grown up in suddenly felt like a very dangerous place to be. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. I stayed at Cassie's place that first night, tossing and turning on her lumpy couch, jumping at every sound. By morning I was exhausted but too wired to rest. Cassie, bless her, didn't push me to talk about it. She just made coffee, stronger than usual, and sat with me in companionable silence as the sun rose. When it was time for me to head to work, she insisted on driving me again. "It's no trouble," she said, waving off my protests. "Besides, I've got some errands to run in that part of town anyway." I knew she was lying. There wasn't much of anything near the gas station, but I was too grateful to call her on it. The next few shifts at work were uneventful, almost boring. No sign of the bikers, no mysterious figures lurking in the shadows. I started to wonder if I'd blown the whole thing out of proportion. Maybe it had just been a couple of rough-looking guys passing through town. Maybe the bikes I'd seen near my apartment were just a coincidence. But then came Friday night, and everything changed. I was working the closing shift again, 4 p.m. to midnight. The sun had set early, as it does in late October, leaving the world outside the gas station shrouded in darkness. Inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I tried to keep myself busy with mundane tasks, restocking shelves, mopping floors, anything to keep my mind occupied. Around 10 p.m., the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat, but it was just old Pete, a regular who came in most nights for his ritual 6-pack and scratch-off tickets. "Evening," he grunted, making his way to the beer cooler. I nodded in response, watching as he grabbed his usual brand and shuffled to the counter. As I rang him up, I noticed he seemed more agitated than usual, his rheumy eyes darting around the store. "Everything okay, Pete?" I asked as I bagged his beer. He leaned in close, his breath sour with alcohol. "You be careful out there," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Something ain't right in these parts lately." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Pete glanced around again as if afraid someone might overhear. "Been seeing things," he muttered, "out in the desert, shapes moving at night, sounds that ain't natural." He shook his head. "And folks going missing, more than usual." I thought of the news report about the missing hiker. "You mean like that guy in Red Rock Canyon?" Pete's eyes widened. "That's just what they're telling folks, but I heard from my buddy who works search and rescue. Says they found that guy's backpack, or what was left of it." He leaned in closer. "Says it looked like something had chewed on it." My mouth went dry. "Come on, Pete," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You know how rumors get started around here?" He shrugged, gathering up his purchases. "Believe what you want, but I'm telling you, something's out there, something hungry." With that ominous pronouncement, he shuffled out into the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I tried to shake off Pete's words, to focus on my work, but as the hours ticked by, I found myself glancing more and more at the darkness beyond the windows. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of wind sounded like footsteps. By the time midnight rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. I rushed through my closing routine, eager to get out of there and back to the relative safety of Cassie's apartment. As I finished up the closing routine, my hands shaking slightly as I counted out the register, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the low rumble of motorcycle engines growing louder by the second. My first instinct was to call Cassie, but I realized with a sinking feeling that my phone was in my car. I was trapped. The engines cut off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Through the glass doors I could see two figures dismounting from their bikes. Even in the dim light of the parking lot, I recognized the hulking shape of the larger biker from a few nights ago. My mind raced. The back door was locked company policy, and the only way out was through the front, right past them. I ducked down behind the counter, praying they hadn't seen me, and fumbled for the ancient landline phone we kept for emergencies. Just as my fingers closed around the receiver, the bell above the door jangled. Heavy footsteps entered the store. "We're closed," I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "You'll have to come back tomorrow." A low chuckle was the only response. The footsteps came closer, slow and deliberate. I could hear them moving through the aisles, knocking things off shelves. "Come on out, little mouse," a gravelly voice called. It was the big guy. "We just want to talk." I stayed silent, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The phone felt useless in my hand. Even if I managed to call for help, the nearest police station was at least 20 minutes away. The footsteps stopped right in front of the counter. I held my breath, pressing myself as far back against the wall as I could. For a long moment there was silence. Then, without warning, a massive hand slammed down on the counter above me. I couldn't help it. I let out a startled yelp. "There you are," the voice growled, filled with a terrible satisfaction. I knew I couldn't hide anymore. Slowly, shakily, I stood up. The big biker was leaning over the counter, his scarred face twisted into a grin that showed too many teeth. His partner, the smaller one, was by the door, keeping watch. "What do you want?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. The big guy's grin widened. "Like I said, we just want to talk about what you saw the other night." I frowned, confused. What I saw? I didn't see anything. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. "Oh, I think you did. Out in the desert. You saw something you weren't supposed to see." My mind raced. I hadn't been out in the desert at night in weeks. What was he talking about? Before I could respond, the smaller biker called out, "We've got company." Headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. The big biker cursed under his breath. "This isn't over," he growled at me. "We'll be seeing you real soon." With that, they were gone, the bell jangling as they rushed out. I heard their motorcycles roar to life and fade into the distance. I was still standing there shaking when Cassie walked in. "Hey, I thought I'd swing by and give you a ride home," she said, then paused, taking in my pale face and trembling hands. "What happened? Are you okay?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, to my horror and embarrassment, I burst into tears. Cassie was at my side in an instant, her arm around my shoulders. "It's okay," she soothed. "You're safe now. Let's get you out of here." As we drove away from the gas station, I managed to choke out what had happened. Cassie listened, her face growing more concerned with each detail. "We need to call the police," she said when I finished. I shook my head. "And tell them what? That some scary-looking guys came into the store and said cryptic things? They were gone before you showed up. There's no evidence, no crime." Cassie frowned but didn't argue. "Okay, but you're staying with me again tonight. No arguments." I nodded gratefully. The thought of being alone in my apartment was more than I could bear. As we drove through the quiet streets of Milldale, a thought struck me. "Cassie," I said slowly, "do you remember that missing hiker, the one from the news?" She nodded. "Yeah, what about him?" "The big biker. He said something about me seeing something I wasn't supposed to see, out in the desert." I swallowed hard. What if it's connected somehow?" Cassie was quiet for a long moment. "That's a pretty big leap," she said finally, "but I guess anything's possible." We rode the rest of the way in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled up to Cassie's apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the edge of something big, something terrible, and somewhere out in the vast, dark desert, something was waiting. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning on Cassie's couch, my mind replaying the events of the night before on an endless loop. Cassie, bless her, had called in sick to work to stay with me. As we sat at her small kitchen table, nursing mugs of strong coffee, she broached the subject we'd both been avoiding. "So," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What do you want to do?" I stared into my coffee, wishing I had an answer. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave town, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was happening as possible. But another part, a part I didn't quite understand, felt compelled to dig deeper. "I think," I said slowly, "I need to find out what's going on, what those guys think I saw." Cassie nodded, as if she'd been expecting this. "Okay, where do we start?" I blinked, surprised. "We?" She rolled her eyes. "You didn't think I was going to let you do this alone, did you? We're in this together now." The rush of gratitude I felt was almost overwhelming. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," I said softly. We spent the morning brainstorming, trying to connect the dots between the bikers, the missing hiker, and whatever was happening out in the desert. By lunchtime we had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one. "Okay," Cassie said, looking over our notes. "So we know the hiker, Michael Chen, went missing in Red Rock Canyon. That's our starting point." I nodded. "And old Pete mentioned his buddy in search and rescue found Chen's backpack, or what was left of it." Cassie frowned. "That wasn't in the news reports. If it's true, why keep it quiet?" "Maybe they didn't want to cause a panic," I suggested. "Or maybe there was something about it they couldn't explain." We looked at each other, the same thought clearly running through both our minds. What could do that kind of damage to a backpack? And more importantly, what could have happened to Chen? "We need to talk to Pete's friend," Cassie said. "See if we can get more details about what they found." I agreed, but there was a problem. Pete's not exactly the most reliable source, and even if his buddy did tell him something, he's not likely to talk to us about it. Cassie got a mischievous glint in her eye. "Leave that to me, I've got an idea." An hour later we were in Cassie's car, heading towards the Red Rock Canyon Visitor Center. Cassie had changed into hiking clothes and was carrying a professional-looking camera. "Remind me of the plan again?" I asked nervously. Cassie grinned. "I'm a freelance journalist working on a piece about hiking safety. You're my photographer. We're just here to get some background info and maybe a few quotes from the rangers." I had to admit it was a good cover story. But as we pulled into the parking lot of the visitor center, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were getting in way over our heads. The center was quiet when we walked in, just a few tourists milling about looking at the exhibits. A bored-looking ranger sat behind the information desk, perking up slightly as we approached. "Welcome to Red Rock Canyon," he said, plastering on a smile. "How can I help you folks today?" Cassie stepped forward, all professional charm. "Hi there. I'm Cassie Moore, freelance journalist. I'm working on a piece about hiking safety, especially in light of recent events. I was hoping to chat with someone about the precautions you take here in the park." The ranger's smile faltered slightly at the mention of recent events, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, we'd be happy to help. Let me see if Ranger Martinez is available. She's our safety coordinator." As he picked up the phone to call, I wandered over to the large map of the park on the wall, trying to look like I was scouting photo locations. In reality, I was straining to hear the ranger's hushed conversation. "Journalist asking questions. Yeah, about that. You sure? Okay, if you say so." He hung up and turned back to us with a slightly strained smile. "Ranger Martinez will be right out. Feel free to look around while you wait." We thanked him and moved away from the desk, pretending to be interested in the wildlife displays. After a few minutes, a door behind the information desk opened, and a woman in a park ranger uniform stepped out. Ranger Martinez was older than I expected, probably in her late 50s, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of long days in the sun. But there was a sharpness to her gaze that made me nervous. "Miss Moore?" she said, approaching us. "I'm Ranger Martinez. I understand you have some questions about our safety protocols." Cassie launched into her prepared spiel about the article she was writing, peppering the ranger with questions about trail maintenance, emergency procedures, and hiker education programs. I had to admire her dedication to the role. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed she was a real journalist. As they talked, I noticed Ranger Martinez relaxing slightly, her answers becoming less guarded. Cassie must have sensed it too, because she chose that moment to broach the subject we'd really come for. Of course, recent events have brought hiking safety into sharp focus, Cassie said carefully. The disappearance of Michael Chen, for instance, has that changed any of your procedures? Ranger Martinez's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. We're always evaluating and updating our safety measures, she said smoothly, but I'm afraid I can't comment on ongoing investigations. Cassie nodded understandingly. Of course, I completely understand. It must be difficult, though, especially if there were any unusual circumstances surrounding the disappearance. For a moment I thought Ranger Martinez was going to shut us down completely, but then something in her expression shifted, almost like she was making a decision. "Why don't we continue this conversation in my office?" she said quietly. "There are some things you should know, off the record, of course." Cassie and I exchanged a quick glance. This was more than we'd hoped for. As we followed Ranger Martinez to her office, my heart was pounding. Whatever she was about to tell us, I had a feeling it was going to change everything. Little did I know just how right I was. Ranger Martinez's office was small and cluttered, the walls covered in maps and wildlife posters. She gestured for us to sit in the 2 chairs across from her desk, then closed the door behind us. For a long moment she just stood there, her back to us, as if gathering her thoughts. When she finally turned around, her face was grave. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," she said, her voice low and intense. "Do you understand?" Cassie and I nodded, not trusting ourselves to speak. Ranger Martinez sat heavily in her chair, suddenly looking much older than she had just minutes ago. "The official story is that Michael Chen went missing while hiking. That's true, as far as it goes. What we didn't tell the public is what we found." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder, spreading its contents on the desk. Photos spilled out. Crime scene photos, I realized with a jolt. "This is what was left of Chen's campsite," Ranger Martinez said, pointing to one of the images. I leaned in, my stomach churning. The photo showed a clearing, the ground torn up as if by some massive struggle. Shreds of what might have been a tent were scattered about, and dark stains marred the rocky soil. "At first we thought it might have been a bear attack," the ranger continued, "but the evidence, it didn't fit. The claw marks we found were all wrong, too big, too widely spaced. And there was this." She pushed forward another photo. It took me a moment to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a footprint pressed deep into the mud, but it was enormous, easily twice the size of a human foot. And the shape? It was all wrong, with what looked like sharp claws at the end of each toe. "What?" I started to say, but my voice failed me. Ranger Martinez's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of fear and determination there. "We don't know," she said simply. "In all my years working these canyons, I've never seen anything like it. But whatever made that print, whatever attacked Chen's camp, it's still out there." Cassie spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. "Why keep this quiet? Shouldn't people be warned?" The ranger sighed. "You have to understand, tourism is the lifeblood of this area. If word got out about whatever this is, it would destroy the local economy, not to mention cause a panic." She shook her head. "We've increased patrols, especially at night. But until we know more, until we can find this thing—" "How many?" I asked suddenly. Both women looked at me, confused. "How many people have really gone missing out here?" Ranger Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "Too many," she said finally. "Chen was the most recent, but he wasn't the first. We've had 5 disappearances in the past year that fit this pattern, that we know of." The implications of that last statement hung heavy in the air. "Why are you telling us this?" Cassie asked. The ranger's gaze was steady. "Because I'm tired of lying. Because people need to know what they're really facing out there. And because—" She hesitated, then seemed to make up her mind. "Because I think you two might be able to help." "Us?" I said, startled. "How?" "You're not really a journalist, are you?" Ranger Martinez said to Cassie, a hint of a smile on her face. "And you're not a photographer. You're here because of what happened at the gas station." I felt the blood drain from my face. "How did you—" "Small town," she said simply. "Word gets around. And those bikers you mentioned? They've been sniffing around here too, asking questions about the disappearances." My mind was reeling. "Do you think they're connected to whatever this is?" Ranger Martinez shrugged. "I don't know, but I do know they're not who they say they are, and I think they know more than they're letting on." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "Look, I can't investigate this officially. Too many higher-ups want it all kept quiet. But you two, you're already involved. You could go places, ask questions that I can't." I looked at Cassie, saw the same mix of fear and determination on her face that I felt. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" I said slowly. The ranger's answer sent a chill down my spine. "I want you to find out what's really happening in Red Rock Canyon, and I want you to stop it, before anyone else disappears." As we left the ranger station, my head was spinning. The weight of what we'd learned, of what we'd agreed to do, felt almost crushing. Cassie and I walked in silence to her car, both lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were on the road, the stark beauty of the desert landscape blurring past the windows, that she spoke. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, her voice a mixture of excitement and fear. I took a deep breath, staring out at the rugged landscape. "I don't think we have a choice," I said finally. "Whatever's out there, it's not going to stop on its own, and if we don't do something, more people are going to disappear." Cassie nodded, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. "So where do we start?" We spent the rest of the drive back to town planning our next move. We decided our first step should be to gather more information about the disappearances, about the bikers, about anything strange happening in or around Red Rock Canyon. "We need to talk to old Pete again," I said. "See if we can get more details about what his search and rescue buddy told him." Cassie agreed. "And we should dig into the backgrounds of the missing hikers. Maybe there's a connection we're not seeing." As we pulled up to Cassie's apartment, a thought struck me. "What about your online classes and our jobs? We can't just drop everything to play detective." Cassie chewed her lip thoughtfully. "I can put my classes on hold for a bit, say there's a family emergency or something. As for work..." She trailed off, then her eyes lit up. "Actually, I might have an idea about that. Let me make a few calls." While Cassie was on the phone, I tried to piece together everything we knew so far. The disappearances, the strange footprint, the bikers who seemed to know more than they should. It all pointed to something big, something dangerous. But what? I was so lost in thought that I jumped when Cassie tapped me on the shoulder. "Good news," she said, grinning. "I called in a favor with my aunt. She owns that little bookstore downtown, remember? She's agreed to give us both part-time jobs, flexible hours, cash under the table." I raised an eyebrow. "And she's okay with us using that as a cover to investigate mysterious disappearances?" Cassie laughed. "I may have neglected to mention that part. As far as she knows, we just need some extra cash and flexible work while we figure out our next steps in life." I had to admit it was a good solution. The bookstore was right in the center of town, which would give us a base of operations and a reason to be asking questions without raising too much suspicion. We spent the rest of the evening making plans and preparations. Cassie dug out an old laptop we could use for research, while I called the gas station to quit my job, citing family issues. It felt strange cutting ties with my old life so abruptly. But as I looked at the notes we'd made, the photos Ranger Martinez had shown us burned into my memory, I knew there was no going back. The next morning we started our investigation in earnest. Our first stop was old Pete's usual haunt, a dingy bar on the outskirts of town that opened improbably early. We found him in his usual spot, nursing a beer despite the early hour. "Well, if it ain't the gas station, kid," Pete slurred as we approached. "And you brought a friend. What can I do for you?" I slid onto the bar stool next to him, Cassie taking the seat on my other side. "Pete, we need to talk about what you told me the other night. About your friend in search and rescue and what they found in the canyon." Pete's roomy eyes narrowed. "Don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, suddenly very interested in his beer. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "Pete, please, this is important. People's lives could be at stake." For a long moment I thought he was going to shut us out completely. Then with a heavy sigh he set down his beer and turned to face us. "My buddy Jim, he's been with Search and Rescue for 20 years, Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Seen all kinds of things out in those canyons. But this..." He shook his head. "This scared him. Said they found that hiker's campsite torn to shreds. And tracks. tracks like nothing he'd ever seen before. Cassie and I exchanged a glance. This matched what Ranger Martinez had told us. "Did he say anything else?" Cassie pressed gently. "Anything about what might have made those tracks?" Pete's eyes darted around the bar as if afraid someone might be listening. Jim's always been a pragmatic sort, man of science, you know. But the way he talked about this... Pete shuddered. He said it was like something out of a nightmare. Said the claw marks they found. They went clean through solid rock. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of creature could do that? "Pete," I said carefully, "has Jim noticed anything else strange lately? Any other unusual sightings or incidents?" Pete was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with whether to say more. Finally, he leaned in close, his breath sour with alcohol. "Jim told me they've been hearing things out there at night, noises that ain't natural, and sometimes when they're out on patrol..." Pete's voice dropped even lower. "Sometimes they feel like they're being watched, like there's something out there in the dark, just waiting." As we left the bar, my mind was racing. Everything Pete had told us seemed to confirm our worst fears, that there was something out there in the canyon, something dangerous and unknown. "We need to go out there," I said as we got into Cassie's car. "We need to see for ourselves." Cassie looked at me, her face pale but determined. "I know," she said, "but we can't just go rushing in unprepared. We need a plan and we need supplies." She was right, of course. Whatever was out there had already taken down experienced hikers. We couldn't just wander into the canyon and hope for the best. We spent the next few days preparing. We bought hiking gear, stocked up on supplies, and pored over maps of the canyon. We also did our best to dig into the backgrounds of the missing hikers, looking for any connections or patterns. What we found was unsettling. While the disappearances seemed random at first glance, we noticed that they all occurred in roughly the same area of the canyon, an area that, according to the maps, contained a network of caves that had never been fully explored. As we made our final preparations, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important. The bikers, the footprints, the caves. How did it all fit together? The night before we were set to head into the canyon, I had a dream. I was standing at the mouth of a cave, darkness yawning before me. From deep within I heard a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. And then, emerging from the shadows, I saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I knew with a certainty I couldn't explain that we were on the verge of uncovering something big, something that would change everything. Little did I know just how right I was. The morning dawned crisp and clear as Cassie and I loaded our gear into her car. We'd told her aunt we were taking a few days off for a camping trip. Not entirely a lie, but far from the whole truth. As we drove towards Red Rock Canyon, an uneasy silence settled between us. The weight of what we were about to do, the dangers we might face, seemed to press down on us like a physical presence. "You know," Cassie said suddenly, breaking the silence, "it's not too late to turn back. We could just go home, pretend none of this ever happened." I looked at her, saw the mix of fear and determination in her eyes that I knew mirrored my own. "Could you really do that?" I asked softly, "knowing what's out there, knowing more people might disappear?" She sighed, shaking her head. "No, I couldn't. I wanted to make sure you knew we had a choice." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "We made our choice the moment we agreed to help Ranger Martinez. Whatever happens, we're in this together." We arrived at the Canyon Visitor Center just as it was opening. Ranger Martinez was waiting for us, her face grim. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as we gathered our backpacks from the car. I nodded. "We're sure. Any last-minute advice?" The ranger handed us each a small device. "Emergency beacons," she explained. "If you run into trouble, activate them. I'll have a team standing by." She hesitated, then added, "But understand, if you activate those beacons, I won't be able to keep this quiet anymore. It'll mean involving the authorities, the media." "We understand," Cassie said. "We'll only use them if absolutely necessary." Ranger Martinez nodded. "Good luck," she said softly. "And be careful out there." With one last look at the safety of the visitor center, we shouldered our packs and set off into the canyon. The first few hours of our hike were uneventful. The beauty of the landscape was breathtaking, towering red rock formations, scrubby desert plants clinging to life in the harsh environment, the vast blue sky stretching endlessly above us. If it weren't for the knot of anxiety in my stomach, it would have been a perfect day for a hike. As we moved deeper into the canyon, following the rough map Ranger Martinez had given us, the terrain became more challenging. We scrambled over boulders, squeezed through narrow passages, always moving towards the area where the disappearances had occurred. It was late afternoon when we reached the first cave entrance. The mouth of the cave yawned before us, a dark slash in the red rock face. I couldn't help but think of my dream, of those glowing eyes emerging from the darkness. "Should we go in?" Cassie asked, her voice hushed. I checked our map. "This isn't the main cave system we're looking for," I said, "but it might be worth checking out. We've got a few hours of daylight left." We clicked on our headlamps and stepped into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately, a welcome relief from the desert heat. Our lights cast eerie shadows on the cave walls, creating shapes that seemed to move in the corner of my eye. We moved slowly, carefully, our eyes scanning for any sign of, well, anything unusual. But aside from some ancient petroglyphs carved into the walls, the cave seemed unremarkable. We were about to turn back when Cassie suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing her light at the cave floor. At first I didn't see what had caught her attention. Then, as I looked closer, I saw it. A footprint pressed into the soft sand of the cave floor. A footprint that matched the photo Ranger Martinez had shown us. My heart began to race. "It's here," I breathed. "Whatever made those tracks at the campsite, it's been in this cave." Cassie nodded, her face pale in the glow of our headlamps. "The track looks fresh," she said. "It could still be nearby." As if in response to her words, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the cave. It was the same sound from my dream, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. We looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. Without a word, we turned and ran, scrambling back towards the cave entrance. Behind us, the growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the cave. We burst out into the fading daylight, gasping for air. Behind us, the growling stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made the sound was unwilling to venture out into the open. What was that?" Cassie panted, bent over with her hands on her knees. I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "I don't know, but I think we just found what we've been looking for." As the adrenaline began to fade, I realized we had a decision to make. Night was falling, and we were deep in the canyon, far from any help. Do we make camp here, knowing that thing might be nearby? Or do we try to hike back in the dark, risking injury on the treacherous terrain? "We should make camp," Cassie said, echoing my thoughts. "But not here. We need to find somewhere defensible, somewhere with a clear view of our surroundings." I nodded in agreement. We quickly gathered our gear and set off, looking for a suitable campsite. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us just out of sight. We finally found a spot as the last light was fading from the sky, a small plateau with a clear view in all directions, backed by a sheer cliff face. We set up our tent in record time, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we knew would be a long, tense night. As we sat by the fire, picking at our trail rations, Cassie finally broke the silence. "What do you think it is?" she asked quietly. "That thing in the cave?" I stared into the flames, trying to make sense of everything we'd seen and heard. "I don't know," I said finally. "But whatever it is, it's big, it's dangerous, and it's not supposed to exist." Cassie nodded slowly. Do you think it's what took those hikers?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. If this creature, whatever it was responsible for the disappearances, then we were dealing with something far more dangerous than we'd initially thought. "I think we need to be very, very careful," I said. "And I think tomorrow we need to find that main cave system. If this thing has a lair, that's where it'll be." We took turns keeping watch that night, but nothing disturbed our camp. As dawn broke, we packed up quickly and set off, following our map towards the larger cave system. The hike was tense, every sound making us jump, every shadow seeming to hide potential danger. But we saw no sign of the creature, heard no more of those bone-shaking growls. It was late morning when we finally found what we were looking for. The entrance to the main cave system was massive, a gaping maw in the side of the canyon wall. Cool air flowed out of it, carrying a musty animal smell that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Cassie and I looked at each other, a silent communication passing between us. We both knew the dangers, knew that stepping into that cave might mean we never came out again. But we also knew we couldn't turn back now, not when we were so close to answers. With a deep breath, we switched on our headlamps and stepped into the darkness. The cave swallowed us whole, the daylight quickly fading behind us as we moved deeper into the earth. We had no way of knowing what we would find in the depths of that cave. But one thing was certain: our lives would never be the same again. The darkness of the cave was oppressive, seeming to press in on us from all sides. Our headlamps cut through the gloom, but the beam seemed feeble against the vast blackness that surrounded us. The air was thick with that musty animal smell, growing stronger with each step we took. We moved slowly, carefully, our eyes constantly scanning the cave walls and floor. The main passage was wide, easily big enough for something large to move through comfortably. That thought sent a shiver down my spine. "Look," Cassie whispered, pointing to the ground. I followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. The cave floor was covered in tracks, some clearly animal, others not. Among the usual prints of desert wildlife, I saw more of those massive, clawed footprints we'd encountered in the smaller cave. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Intermixed with the animal tracks were human footprints, and drag marks, long furrows in the sandy floor that spoke of bodies being pulled deeper into the cave. Cassie and I exchanged a grim look. We were on the right track, but the implications of what we were seeing were horrifying. As we moved deeper into the cave system, the passages began to branch off, creating a complex maze of tunnels. We marked our path with small cairns of stones, not wanting to risk getting lost in this underground labyrinth. We had been walking for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional drip of water, when we heard it. A low, keening sound echoing through the tunnels. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with a sense of ancient, primordial hunger. Cassie grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. The sound came again, louder this time, and unmistakably closer. Whatever was making that noise, it was moving towards us. "We need to hide," I hissed, pulling Cassie towards a narrow side passage we had just passed. We squeezed into the tight space, pressing ourselves against the cold rock wall. I reached out and switched off both our headlamps, plunging us into total darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our ragged breathing and the thundering of my heart. Then we heard it, the sound of something large moving through the main passage, the scrape of claws on stone, the low rumbling breath of a massive creature. It paused near our hiding spot, and I held my breath, certain that at any moment it would discover us. But after what felt like an eternity, the creature moved on, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. We waited several more minutes before daring to turn our lights back on. Cassie's face was pale in the harsh glare of the headlamp. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice shaky but determined. I nodded in agreement, but something caught my eye further down the narrow passage we were in. "Wait," I said, holding up a hand. "Look at this." Our lights revealed a small opening in the cave wall, easily missed if you weren't looking closely. And there, carved into the rock around the opening, were symbols, ancient petroglyphs depicting strange, monstrous figures. "What is this?" Cassie breathed, running her fingers over the carved images. I shook my head, mystified. "I don't know, but it looks important. We should check it out." Carefully, we squeezed through the opening, finding ourselves in a small chamber. What we saw there made us both gasp. The walls of the chamber were covered in more petroglyphs, telling a story that was as fascinating as it was terrifying. They showed human figures worshipping a massive, monstrous creature, the same creature, I realized with a chill, that we had just narrowly avoided in the main passage. "Look at this," Cassie said, pointing to one section of the wall. The images there showed the creature emerging from a crack in the earth, with stars and celestial bodies arranged above it. "It's not from here," I said slowly, the realization dawning on me. "Whatever this thing is, it came from somewhere else, maybe another planet or another dimension." Cassie nodded, her eyes wide. "And these people, they worshipped it, brought it sacrifices." The implications of that last word hung heavy in the air between us. We both thought of the missing hikers, the drag marks we had seen on the cave floor. As we studied the petroglyphs, a pattern began to emerge. The images seemed to be telling us not just about the creature's origins, but about its weaknesses. "Look here," I said, pointing to one section. "They're showing the creature retreating from fire and from sunlight." Cassie leaned in closer. "And this part," she said, "I think it's showing some kind of ritual, a way to banish the creature, send it back where it came from." We spent the next hour carefully documenting everything we saw, taking photos with our phones and making sketches in our notebooks. By the time we were done, we had a clearer picture of what we were dealing with and how we might stop it. But as we prepared to leave the chamber, we heard that bone-chilling sound again, the keening cry of the creature, much closer this time. "It's coming back," Cassie whispered, fear evident in her voice. I nodded grimly. "We can't stay here. We need to make a run for it." We burst out of the small chamber and back into the main passage, our headlamps bouncing wildly as we ran. Behind us we could hear the creature's roar, the sound of its massive body squeezing through the tunnels in pursuit. We ran blindly, no longer caring about marking our path, focused only on finding the way out. The sound of the creature grew louder, closer, with each passing second. Just when I thought we couldn't run any further, I saw a glimmer of light ahead, the cave entrance. "There," I shouted to Cassie, "we're almost out." We put on a final burst of speed, lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. Behind us, the creature let out a deafening roar that shook the very walls of the cave. We burst out into the sunlight, the sudden brightness momentarily blinding us. I expected to feel the creature's claws at any moment, but the attack never came. When our eyes adjusted, we turned to look back at the cave entrance. There, just inside the shadows, we saw it, a massive, hulking shape, its yellow eyes glowing with malevolence. But it didn't follow us out into the daylight. Remembering what we had learned from the petroglyphs, I grabbed Cassie's arm. "Quick," I said. "We need to find some way to block the entrance. It can't come out in the sunlight." Working quickly, we gathered rocks and boulders, piling them in front of the cave mouth. It wouldn't hold the creature forever, but it might buy us some time. As we worked, I activated the emergency beacon Ranger Martinez had given us. Within an hour, we heard the sound of approaching helicopters. The next few days passed in a blur. We told our story to Ranger Martinez, and then to a team of government officials who arrived soon after. At first they were skeptical, but the evidence we had gathered, the photos, the sketches, the tracks we had documented, was hard to ignore. A large-scale operation was launched to seal off the cave system. Experts were brought in to study the petroglyphs and to try to understand the nature of the creature we had encountered. Cassie and I were sworn to secrecy, told that revealing what we had seen could cause widespread panic. But we were also thanked for our bravery, for uncovering a threat that had been lurking unknown for who knows how long. In the months that followed, we tried to return to our normal lives. But how do you go back to normal after something like that? The nightmares were frequent, the feeling of being watched in the dark never quite going away. But we had each other, and the knowledge that we had made a difference, that we had saved lives, even if the world would never know about it. Sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself looking up at the stars, wondering about what else might be out there, wondering if the creature we encountered was truly one of a kind, or if there are more like it, waiting in the dark spaces between the stars. One thing I know for certain, I'll never look at the world the same way again. There are things out there, ancient and powerful things, that defy our understanding of reality, and sometimes, just sometimes, those things find their way into our world. But as long as there are people willing to stand against the darkness, to shine a light into the unknown, there's hope. Cassie and I learned that in the depths of that desert cave, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.